If I could sum up this year with 3 words, it would probably be expectations, reality, disappointment. Rather lackluster year, truth to be told. Most big boy projects were either offensively average or so disappointing I forgot I've even watched them this year and not in 1997. The sad part is that the next year doesn't promise to be that good either. Most of what I see is either following the previous year trends, some nostalgia bait, or something I would want to watch only out of morbid curiosity, and now I have to give some arbitrary awards to this whole drivel. Well, let's begin then. Also, still can't be arsed to draw actual awards for them, so I don't know, just Google a goose face and put it on the poster as a sign of my approval or something. Honestly speaking, this year was a very divisive one on what I actually consider to be good, and it was very hard to choose between Hakume and Mikochi and How to Not Summon a Demon Lord. One is better on a technical level, but the story wasn't that original even though I liked it, while the other is worse technically, and now that I think about it, the story isn't as original as I thought it to be initially, but I still think it's good by dialogue alone. I'll let them both be on it. After all, nothing unites people better than a hatred to compromise. Not really much to say about it, cause I think it's pretty self-explanatory if you know my previous worst anime of the year, but unlike Aho Girl, this anime was saved purely because of its art style and because it really doesn't pretend to be anything better than it is, so I can't really be angry on it for too long. Not sure if it's fair to put short animes on this list, but since this is the first anime that made me physically ill, I guess it qualifies for the worst nomination, and so our first worst anime award goes to Honda-san. I would probably place it on a higher spot, but I haven't watched the entirety of it, and the only thing I remember about it is the crippling headache from the graphics, so there's that. Violet Evergarden was a very pretty anime to watch, albeit slightly predictable, so I would have probably gave this anime a place on this top 5 for the visuals alone, because competence has to be rewarded, but thankfully it was also a very well made drama, at least on a technical level. There's a lot of things that I love, there's one thing that I hate, and there are things that just bore me, and Hinamatsuri is probably just that. A mediocre anime that's not special in any way, shape or form. The only reason why it's not higher is because I at least remember it enough to use it as a reference. Japanese can't really do action well unless it's either very short or the size of a Viking saga. The problems with it always fall into one of several deal breakers. Its plot makes barely any sense, like in its visuals are basic bitch fanservice, or it's just blatantly boring to watch, and the only reason Killing Bites is here is because it managed to combine all 3 aforementioned flaws yet be so boring I nearly forgot it existed. Disappointing, really. I did not expect much and you still underachieved. I was kind of torn between Rascal Doesn't Dream of Bunny Girl Senpai and A Place Further Than the Universe, and the only reason why it is even in here is because I remember more about the former than the latter, and as I've said before, this year wasn't really that notable for good stuff, so it's either this or nothing. So congrats, Rascal! Your Diet Bakemonogatari ways have given you an arbitrary award. You know, this almost slipped into the bad category, but in the end of the day, it was competent enough to not be shit, but not good enough to be the actual best. Congrats, Darling and the Franks, you're better than whatever next anime is going to be. Shame you were so boring and forgettable that I can't even remember what I liked or hated in you in the first place. Video game adaptations to anime is what anime and comic book adaptations to movies, now that I think about it. Though some of those are good, they are a tiny speck of sand in the vast desert of mediocrity and piss, and nothing better illustrates it than Caligula. The only reason why this is worse than Thousand Musketeers is that at least that looks like an anime. This is just a bunch of poorly stringed cutscenes from the game, and that's me being very generous towards it. I still stand by my words that this is the closest modern anime had come to my golden standard of adaptation, and for that, Banana Fish, I will give you the 2nd place on this poll. If it weren't for you, I would have had to give this place to Devilman Crybaby, and to be honest, I didn't really like it outside of music, so all's well that ends well. Do you remember that Ancient Magus Bride came this year? I didn't. In fact, it took me a while to even remember what it even was. To think that this thing was so talked about when I watched it, only to be turning out so mediocre and forgettable. Not even porn saved it, and that's impressive in its own right. Speaking of adaptations, if video game adaptations are like the visual representation of that "how do you do fellow kids" meme, visual novel adaptations are the big toenails of anime industry. They serve no practical purpose other than eventually growing into your skin and catching infection, and Island is a great example of that, being not only very confusing plot-wise, but also just life-drainingly dull, though considering that this is a story about time travel, one shouldn't be too surprised. The most obvious candidate for anime of the year would be the absolutely magnificent Conception, but I'm sadly forced to disqualify it because it was so incredibly good that it caused some kind of reality collapse that erased it from existence and replaced it with a show about getting women pregnant, but not really. Besides that, 2018 didn't have a Little Witch Academia. That is an anime I can call really good without having to qualify the statement, but since I'm forced to pick from the Focomelia babies, Zombieland Saga was probably the one with the least birth defects. Though the plot and characters presumably came free with the script writing software, Zombieland Saga successfully balances comedy and drama and have managed to be an original anime that's actually good, and that's already impressive as far as I'm concerned. I wanted to choose an anime that would represent all the animes that were so mind-bogglingly boring but weren't so bad I wanted to slit my throat with a copy of Werka Serduchka album, and Thousand Noble Musketeers are the prime example of such. I'm honestly not sure if I can even call it an anime, it's more of a trainer video for insomniacs. In an industry where making original ideas is like snow and Sahara Desert, new intellectual properties should be encouraged as they make their first steps towards their first paycheck, but it doesn't mean they should get complacent, and so I give the first place of the year's shittiest show award to Derrida, who drunkenly stumbled through time. If it just had a main character who was as appealing as an angry cat that's been strapped to the side of your head, that might have been enough, but the plot and the action was like eating a pancake whose maker gave up halfway through making it and then just rolled his balls on it and deep-fried the result. Only at least filming that would have been more entertaining. You know, it's not a good sign that they've started to animate things I actually know about. It makes me paranoid that sooner or later I'll have to watch something I already read, and thus compromising my opinion about it even more than I already have, and the next thing you know I'll start to make pretentious videos explaining why some vaguely old obscure anime is the best thing ever happened since the invention of penicillin. The Promised Neverland is a 12-episode anime made by Cloverworks, and though I've never read the manga it was adapted from, I've heard a lot of positive things about it, mostly that it features actual children as protagonists. Contrary to what a lot of people believe about anime, there's not a lot of it where preteen kids get to be protagonists, and those that do usually either made specifically for them or feature themes that are at best bleak, at worst aren't meant to be viewed even by certain categories of adults. So in the far year of 2040-something, there exists a totally not evil orphanage where children live a happy life without any need or want with their totally not evil mama, and anyone who have read or seen pretty much any work of fiction will tell you that this isn't a good sign. Predictably, two of our three main protagonists, Norman and Emma, eventually see that the orphanage is in reality a human farm for demons and decided that they should run away from this place, but since Mama also work for demons, Norman, Ray and Emma team up to outwit her and escape. So yes, the general premise of this anime is so old it's a viable candidate for presidency, but as we all can probably agree upon, ideas are worthless without a decent realization, and for the most part, the plot is structured pretty well. According to my employers, the genres people usually ascribe to this anime are sci-fi, horror, and drama. And while I'll agree with them on the drama part as the story is very character-centric, the other two left me baffled. Of course, the term science fiction is applied to pretty much anything these days, but usually it means fiction dealing with advanced science, technology, or societies that are highly speculative, experimental, or idealistic. And unless the inevitable second season is going to have some impossible technology, there's nothing in here that just screams science fiction. All tech they use is pretty much World War II era, and almost nothing that's actually fictitious is explained or explored. Horror, on the other hand, is a bit harder to debunk, since horror is subjective, but there's not a lot of things that I found to be scary or that could scare people. Sure, the plot has the required imminent threat, the imagery tries to make you feel uneasy, and the music occasionally gives you those horror orchestra vibes, but I doubt a lot of people would even be a bit scared. Uncomfortable? Sure, but if I suddenly and without any warning went boo on you, that wouldn't suddenly make my entire ramble a horror, that would just make me look like a dick. So, did you actually like the anime? Well, I liked the parts with Sister Krone. She's not a very creatively written character, true, but she was expressive, fun to watch, and she has the face of a person you would never want to leave children with unless you wanted them to experience a practical demonstration of the term deflower. But what about the rest of it? The graphics are pretty okay, some of it was a bit weird, but I've glanced at how they looked in the manga and they're just as weird there, so this is more of a stylistic choice than a direct fuck-up. There is 3D in this, but only used on the environment, not the characters, at least as far as I've noticed, which is probably the best way to utilize it. The music is a mixed bag. The opening is catchy, and the music overall wasn't bad, if a bit invasive, but the sound work was all over the place, as in some parts the music was too loud and deafened whatever the characters talked about. Sometimes their lines were either corrupted or cut, and there's at least one scene in episode 11 where Ray was most definitely voiced by 2 different voice actors. Overall, this isn't a bad show, but most definitely not for everyone. Your enjoyment will greatly depend on you giving a shit about the characters as well as your ability to keep up with all the scheming and planning. And the moment the show loses you, I doubt that you'll be able to be interested in it for too long, as outside of those, The Promised Neverland is fairly generic in its execution, and you never want a generic execution because bored executioners make the best sodomites.
Sometimes I think I'm cursed. Whatever anime I actually like usually either ends up doing something really stupid like making a mobile game or just having a troubled life overall. I liked Kemono Friends. It's even in my top 5 best anime of 2017, but I've watched it, liked it, and moved on to other anime, and apparently there was a fucking war going on in the meanwhile that I've completely skipped. People got fired, shots were fired, penguins got sexually attracted to cardboard cutouts, and here I am just waltzing into the second season of Kemono Friends, never hearing a thing about this all, and now I know that it was so hated by Japanese they've written entire doujinshis dedicated to hating on Kadokawa. Now I'm kinda scared to think about Zombieland Saga. Next time I check it will turn out that it was made by actual zombies who got hired because undead labor is cheaper. But yes, Kemono Friends 2 is the second season to Kemono Friends 1, a 2017 darling that people liked. Actually, I don't really know why people liked it. The romantic side of me wants to say that people liked it because it had an amateur charm as well as likable characters, meanwhile the cynical side of me says that people liked the anime because girls in it look fuckable, and let's face it, it's not often you get to stick your dick in the entire animal kingdom, might as well make them sexy while you're at it. Our story begins in a decrepit facility where a human of unknown sex awakens and stumbles upon Serval and Caracal, and after getting a silly name, they all go on an adventure to find Kyril's house, wherever it is, and that's pretty much it for the plot. I must say the show overall has a very strange feel to it, which isn't really surprising considering its history, but still. My first alarm bells started to ring during the opening, which honestly just felt wrong. I know that's some high-level objectivity coming from me, but it's really hard to pin what exactly I didn't like and not look petty in the process. I guess I didn't like the pacing of the melody as well as the way they introduced random animals. Of course, I have to remind you that the original wasn't exactly Mozart, but there was just something off in it up until episode 6-7, where they finally learned how to do a bloom effect. The second alarm bell rang once I've seen the graphics on the show and the characters that stared directly into the viewer's soul. Then it hit me why I wasn't so keen both on it and the opening. It all looks and acts like the people who made it had a basic understanding of why the show was popular, yet haven't exactly grasped it completely, which is why I would say 1st to 5th episodes just feel uncanny, as if we've already seen this before in a show that actually has a soul or doesn't look like Go Diego Go Anime Edition. Thankfully, after this the show stops pretending to mimic the first season and actually starts to look more like a legitimate sequel, though the soullessness never really goes anywhere, and it's during episode 11 the third alarm started to ring loudly in my ears, and it began when we discovered the main gimmick of this season, and more importantly, Kyril's general reaction. To be frank, up until that very moment, the character was barely a character that only had 2 emotions, opened mouth and smile, and in some episodes he was downright sociopathic, so once he started to ramble about his love to old friends and such, I nearly spat my proverbial porridge. I'm sorry, what? Since when? Not only you got barely any emotions talking to them, what have you done to deserve their love? By the end, Kapan actually sacrificed herself to save the park. What have you done? You brought an unstable girl you've barely interacted with who then promptly dies for reasons unknown. Some heroic shit right here, let me tell ya. But I digress. As I've said before, the graphics in the beginning were ranging from uncanny to just weird, but it gradually changed to be tolerable by modern standards, and I think at least once in a while they just tossed all of that 3D shit aside and drew everything. I think my biggest nitpick in the graphics was the monster design. It just felt very awkward and artificial. The music is for the most part the same as it was in the first season, so there's nothing really to comment on otherwise. The wob wobs go to monsters, the happy tunes go to friends. So to summarize, if you didn't like the first season or thought it was just okay, then this one is just another boring, unremarkable anime with no redeeming qualities other than cute girls. If you liked the first season, however, then depending on your involvement with the fandom, it will range from just okay to fucking insulting for a variety of reasons. I myself will go into just okay, or to be more precise, just okay, but I haven't
have a feeling that I'll forget about it. Look, that black hole photo looks like a chicken's eye. As long-time viewers probably know, this show is built on 3 pillars. Anime, my hatred for a Solnik, and fairness. And quite frankly, I think it's unfair to only shit on Kemono Friends too, especially when the people who made the first season have buggered off and made Kemerikasa at the same time. Yeah, remember previously I briefly mentioned a war going on? Entertaining story, that one, but since I ramble about anime, not some random people I don't care about, here's a brief summary. Tatsuki, indie man, very famous, has a studio, won awards, hired to make a shitty mobile game adaptation, makes Kemono Friends Season 1. People liked it. Kadokawa fires Tatsuki and his studio because reasons. Kadokawa put some unlucky bastard to make Kemono Friends Season 2. Tatsuki and his team made Kemerikasa. People's asses spontaneously combust. Kemerikasa is a 12-episode remake of his earlier work of the same name. In case if you're wondering, no, it's not worth it, because the first 2 episodes are basically a condensed version of the same events. The only things that are different are the characters' design and the graphics that managed to be even worse. So before I start to ramble about the plot, you know, when I watched Kemono Friends, I thought the graphics were like that due to low budget, but apparently this is pretty much the style of this studio. Can't complain really, with my videos being basically slideshows, but yes, if you're spoiled by modern cartoon graphics, or heaven forbid Western 3D animation, then you've probably already ran for the hills, because the graphics in this anime is shit. Not Berserk levels of shit, because that was animated by a herd of Japanese macaques, more like Arpeggio of Blue Steel. Shit, but tolerable, and you'll probably get used to it in 2-4 episodes anyway. The music is pretty much the same, love it or hate it, no memorable tracks outside of opening and ending. And now, the plot. God knows where, there's an area surrounded by a dangerous red mist. Humans residing in that region live on separated islands and fight red bugs that are bad and want to kill humans. One day when they found a rare water source, that water source shut out some new weird human that they reasonably tried to murder. Failing that, the newcomer saves one of them and then they all go on a journey. Allegedly to find more water, effectively for shits and giggles. So far, so simple. In fact, boiled to basics, this is pretty much a repeat of Kemono Friends, only with a more diverse cast of characters, but it's not the worst. At least on paper. See, the biggest barrier for people to understand the plot will be that it literally starts in the middle of its meta-narrative. The characters know more than you, and they constantly refer to events they have no idea about, and our main protagonist, who's supposed to be our middleman, isn't helping the matters either, because when he isn't jerking off to potted plants, he sounds at best over-enthusiastic and at worst over-dramatic. To understand how irritating he can be, find an article about the most horrible event you can think of and try to read it in the most happy-go-lucky voice you can muster. Sounds annoying, doesn't it? And you know, this wouldn't be as bad of a thing if the plot actually went in an understandable direction, but instead each episode and even the ending leaves more questions than answers. Why is she a cat? Who is our main protagonist? Is the first person alive? Are any of them alive? Where are the supervisors of this project? Did they just have a prolonged lunch break or something? And where even are we anyway? Because the ending scene sure doesn't look habitable by any humans. What is this? What? And that's pretty much it. What and a dramatic pause perfectly sums up my overall feelings towards the show, but in the end of the day, confusing doesn't mean bad, and I can perfectly see people liking this anime purely because it's so weird, and this is probably the target audience for this sort of show. People who like strange anime about sort of post-apocalyptic adventures Girls Lost Tour style. To the rest of you, it's made with care, sure, but otherwise it's a mediocre 3D anime with no redeeming qualities outside of cute girls. But I already hear you asking, so which one of these two is better? And to that I say, neither. Because you're forcing me to choose between something that has polish but lacks a soul and something that has a soul but lacks everything else. Of course, most of you will probably say that the latter is always more enjoyable, but my standards aren't so low to praise any run-of-the-mill indie shit that comes my way. They're both mediocre. Both world building is insulting, albeit for different reasons. Both characters and the plot in a general sense are forgettable, albeit for different reasons, and I'll probably forget all about them 2 weeks after this all, and so will most of you outside of die-hard fans, but that's just tribalism in a nutshell. Cults of personalities are always like that. They all usually last until either your first fuck-up or until you die, after which those who happily praised you will start to just as happily deface you from everything they can find. And I don't know about you, but I will happily wait the next 3-4 years, after which the best thing people will remember about it is sucking dicks and scandals. Now that I think about it, it's basically Ilona Staller's biography.
Have I ever talked about why I don't like review scores? Honestly, I don't remember. Make a sufficient number of these videos and you're bound to start repeating yourself eventually. But anyway, I don't like review scores. They provide an easy way out. You don't have to try and explain to people why the visuals are bad or why the plot is poorly written. You just slap a number on it and let people decide by themselves if it's worth their time or not. I can see why people like that approach, but to me that's just boring. Lazy, mostly. After all, I'm kinda wasting wasting my time listening to your opinion and not watching numbers, but also boring. Unwieldy as well, because sometimes you'll get stuff like Radiant and you look at it and are like, how the fuck am I supposed to score this? Now, Radiant is a 21-episode anime made by Lerche, based on a French manga series written by Tony Valenti. Yes, they make manga-styled things there. They're pretty much the bastion of European-based comics, all things considered. Some things just never change. Our story goes kinda like this. In a world that looks suspiciously like the one from Ruby, only with flying islands, giant eggs of unknown origin bombard the surface of our planet, and weird things come out of them, which are known as the Nemesis. By the way, come to think of it, outside of Wakfu, nearly all French fantasy works I've been reading recently had flying islands. But anyway, Nemesis are dangerous because outside of being bigger than a human, they can also utilize the local mana called Fantasia, which means that this cute little thing also shoots massive laser beams. People who are touched by a Nemesis grow some magic cancer and become sorcerers that are hated because xenophobia, but since they're the only ones that can touch the Nemesis, they are kinda, sorta, but not really tolerated. Our lead is Seth, a spunky young teenager with a heart of gold that looks like the bastard child of Grey Fullbuster and any black-haired shonen protagonist since 2001. After learning some important lessons about the world, Seth sets course to level himself up and eventually reach the fabled planet of Radiant and enact the first ever recorded planetside. And so the usual things for shonen commence that are so common you can practically sing them out as a lullaby. New friends, weird people, home base, weird events, balls, battle, and end phase. If you've watched any long-running shonen, be it any of the big three or any newer ones, you'll quickly find yourself familiar with both its setting and overall actions. In fact, a lot of this series reminds me of Fairy Tail, only with a lot more hatred towards mages, which in itself is ultimately not a bad thing as long as it entertains, and for the most part, entertain it does. This is a well-made shonen anime, both structurally and technically. The plot is smooth and knows when to be funny and when to be serious. The visuals are generally typical for the genre, but are detailed and epic during fight scenes. The music is non-invasive and unmemorable, but still nice to listen to. However, for some reason I couldn't watch more than 3 to 4 episodes in a row without subconsciously starting to do my paperwork, or turning it off and forgetting to come back to it for a few days or so. Thankfully, the show has very neat recaps before every episode, so you never get too lost in the plot, although sometimes it gets slightly absurd, like in the Broom Race episode when they reuse 5 to 10 minutes worth of footage from previous episodes, and I'm not entirely sure whether to be thankful or offended. When gathering some information on it, and by that I mean going on the wiki, of course, one of the reviewers there said something along the lines of, it's not trying to revolutionize the genre, but it pays a great homage. And honestly, I couldn't have said it better if I tried. It's by far not the worst anime I've ever seen, quite the opposite in fact, as when I was watching it I was at least entertained, but either because of my burnout or just because the anime is so average, it might run the world record in the department in which I don't want to return to it, nor do I really have any specific memories about it outside of it was nice, predominantly because it was formulaic enough to go into that part of your brain where everything average ends, yet not formulaic enough to just be lost there. If you've watched all of Toriko, Fairy Tail, and similar anime and want your fix, then this anime was literally made for you. To the rest of you, this is just a good, but average Fairy Tail fanfiction. Might grow on you, but you'll more than likely be bored. But if it does grow on you, great. But go see your doctor, cause that's probably unhealthy.
It really annoys me that people call these things reviews when they're rambles first and foremost. Firstly, for it to be a review, I have to keep it at least for 10 or so minutes, and I couldn't be fucked to do that. And secondly, a reviewer has to make references and use official classifications along with qualified sources, and to put it in a way modern kids will understand, this shit stinks poo-poo. Just look at this bare buggery. Mystery, horror, psychological, it's as if we're still living in 2060s when an aspiring writer had the magnificent option of writing a poem, writing a bigger poem, writing a text, or get fucked. At the very least, Wikipedia tells what it actually is. Urban fantasy. See, it wasn't that hard to give it a proper name. The people writing this shit are so postmodernist that any genre term harder than one word makes them burst into flames or something. Anyway, Boogie Pop, and no, I refuse to call it in any other way, fuck you, is an 18-episode urban fantasy show developed by Madhouse in 2019. Not to be confused with Boogie Pop, a 12-episode urban fantasy show developed by Madhouse in 2000s. I seriously hope that this doesn't become a trend like in video games where I have 3 million games named the same way because of brand recognition, though as far as I understood, this one was made to celebrate the anniversary of the light novel, so maybe it's just that special of an occasion. Who knows? The plot is that it doesn't have a plot, and yes, I'm serious. The overarching narrative is that there's this thing called Boogie Pop, and it exists to kill people who have the power to drastically change either reality itself or the perception of reality as we know it. The anime is neatly divided into 4 separate stories with reoccurring characters, and they're loosely connected with each other, but ultimately none of them or what they do matters in the long run, and neither is Boogie Pop, which kinda shows up to spout amateur philosophy class at the viewer and finish off or spare the bad guy. In case if you still haven't got the memo yet, I didn't like the plot. Well, at least mostly. I liked the Imaginator arc, and the Fear Ghoul one was also fine, but overall I couldn't shake off the feeling of pretentiousness that towered over me like a really erect willy. And outside of characters being pretentious, there's really nothing to them for the most part, because they have either no personality whatsoever or die and serve as a way to gain sympathy points for the rest. The graphics were pretty nice and smooth outside of few scenes, and even the scenes clearly designed to save money were executed well and go in tone with the rest of the visuals. And speaking of visuals, the fight scenes alone were gorgeous looking and have none of the usual flashy Japanese aesthetics, which to me is a good thing since the show tries to take itself seriously, so flashy attacks would look out of place. The music is also nice, a nice mix of electro, ambient and rock, which for some reason reminded me of both Devilman Crybaby and Bella Modica, and I would actually want to listen to it separately. I also had fun time watching and comparing the openings of this and 2000's Boogie Pop, mostly because they both are the quintessential openings of their time. One has some classy tune of Hellsing and Berserk anime, and the other has Myth and Droid that I swear is in pretty much every action anime these days. Though ultimately I am at best neutral to this anime, it would be unfair for me to call it shit or bad. That would be me lying. And if you like urban fantasy genre, then so far this is the best this season has to offer in both themes, story and visuals alike. And if you are already a fan of Boogie Pop, then I personally think it represented the source material pretty well. However, if you aren't willing to sit through planks talking philosophy for 24 or so minutes and want something more action-packed, then I suggest watching something else. The same goes for people who are into more easily digestible stuff like harem anime or those soft tasty biscuits.
Now that I think about it, so far this season was nothing but overall mediocrity. There's nothing wrong with that, but it makes me paranoid that eventually I'll bumble into something boring and or shitty, ruining my mood for the next 2 weeks or so. And since most of the anime remaining are either gossip anime or something long and obnoxious, the thinner my list becomes, the more chances for that. Tensei Shitara Shiraimu Dataken, aka That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime, aka Slimy Sky, besides name-wise reminding me of Konosuba, is a 24, but more like 27 episode, trapped in another world anime created by 8-bit from... oh god, I think it's a novel? No. Not a light novel, an actual novel, but I'm honestly not sure and can't muster enough energy to care. The plot starts like a typical trapped in another world story. Our protagonist works in a soul-sucking job, gets stabbed, and dies. While dying though, something was listening to his dying rambles and based on them created the biggest Gary Stew that ever Mary sued the land, with powers such as a built-in magic wiki, the ability to assimilate abilities, and, well... being a slime, as you do. And after befriending and eating a dragon in the first few episodes, our hero encounters a small goblin village and starts to play out a strategy game, and that's pretty much it. So yeah, the plot's fairly generic for a story of this type. There are some interesting ideas, like for the most part the idea of dealing with nations that are basically glorified city-states and the power of name-giving, but to me this is slowly but surely starting to be insufficient. Every isekai these days has an interesting gimmick, from a world populated only by fantasy races but no humans, to bestowing powers to women via fucking. But unless the world is genuinely unique or grotesque enough, the story will almost always go into one of several predictable directions, rendering these quirks moot. Slime Isekai has a gimmick, that instead of already having a base or trying to just survive in the world, our hero slowly builds a city-state of his own, unifying all races of the Jura Forest under his leadership by giving them names and binding them to his service. And that's all things considered, a decent gimmick, but since our hero is overpowered enough to one-shot most dangers of this world, and what he can't face he routinely surely can, it suffers from the same problem as Overlord, overload, in that there's no sense of tension or threat from the fights, so all there is to do is simply enjoy the spectacle. But the other thing that ruffles my slime containers is that the show can't decide on if it wants to be a wannabe overlord or a wannabe Konosuba, so it kinda tries to simultaneously be both, and as a result the tone's inconsistent at best. One episode we're fighting a giant thing that summons flying spirit sharks, and the next 3 we're taking care of some children that we've only seen once. 1 minute we're witnessing serious discussions of Demon Lord politics, the other our hero feeds one of the Demon Lords his body honey, thus making him her best friend. And this sort of back and forth between seriousness and comedy irritated me to no end. It's as if the show tries to hide behind it and not actually commit to anything, thus not succeeding in building anything, like some people with neutrality. The graphics and the music are fairly generic as well, albeit serviceable. The character designs are a bit meh, but not too ugly, so thank God for that. Even so, I can't really say I was bored with the show. It's entertaining in that protein bar sort of way, but that's probably the show's biggest strength. I usually have a hard time watching more than 4 to 6 episodes in a day, because I have to analyze them as well, but here I blasted through 17 episodes with ease, finishing the rest after the proxy had a quick nap, so I can't really say I hated the experience. Unlike Radiant, which is generic enough but not too generic, Slime is exactly the sort of generic that will provide decent, light-hearted entertainment. That's hard to complain about without looking pretentious, but I won't grant it anything else, as you'll forget about it 2 to 4 days after watching, up until the second season comes out. I enjoyed it, but to be honest, I don't want a continuation. I want to play some sort of Japanese, real-life strategy game where various Japanese fantasy races duke it out on a map, Empire Earth style, and frankly, a lot of interesting ideas can be used from this anime. Or maybe that's just me wanting to play a game. I wish I had hands.
Another comedy anime, another stream of poop jokes and contrivances about as justified as calling a vegan sausage. Another opening paragraph in which I desperately try to stall time before the inevitable ramble, as I and probably most of you realize that I am not really suited to talk in any credible way about comedy or slice of life animes when my sense of humor is about as developed as that of a centipede, while slice of life anime are for those modern posh people whose ideas of romance or human interaction are about as convoluted as an average idea of a magic spell or dating. But since I've done most of the interesting stuff this season, it's time to scrape the bottom of the barrel before our inevitable conclusions. The first one on our list is Virtual Son wa Miteru, which is about what you expect from this sort of name. YouTubers, or social influencers, as they called by people whose daily diet consists of diluted cum and children's tears, are in their sort of early young adult phase of life, and the rebellious puberty is kinda over, but outside of eccentric weirdos, most are yet to take them seriously enough to consider viable, so they try their best to show their older and more respectable colleagues, See, we too can be just like you, senpai! And the results of such ventures are usually fairly predictable. Should you be brave or tolerant enough to withstand the graphics and all of their Let's Play VR chatroom glory and the main characters that are moving as if they all suffer from an epileptic seizure, or at the very least try their hardest to give you one, you'll quickly find out that the show is fairly boring to watch to anyone who isn't already into this virtual YouTuber business. The comedy is more flaccid than the tires of my employer's cars, and to be frank, Pop Team Epic does their shtick a lot better. And now, Domestic Nakanojo. Domestic Nakanojo is a typical romance anime. Thank you for watching this week's ramble. See you next week. That was 2-3 days of my life surely well spent. You know, it's kinda strange to see similarities in the languages I'm using for this show. Typical and tipoi are similar in meaning, and to be honest, always reminded me of the word type more than the word generic. When I hear typical, I usually think of something like a stack of papers or something physical, not a reoccurrence, but watching Domestic Not Incest isn't even typical in a stack of papers sort of way. It's more like you're forced to go to a party you don't want to go, surrounded by people you don't like but can't escape, or at the very least kill something. Anyway, stop me if you heard this one before. Domestic Nakanojo is a 12-episode romantic slice-of-life anime about a young boy that slowly but surely develops a small harem of girls, but he allows only one, and so he has to maneuver himself between them because they're kinda important or unstable. There, that sums up roughly the entirety of the plot. The anime is what we in educated circles call a slow burner, or as I like to call it, it feels so fucking drawn out in the beginning that eventually your brain enters a catatonic state and stops caring about what's happening on the screen. The plot is partially to blame for it. While it doesn't have the cognitive dissonance of Slime, it has characters about as predictable as you could expect from this sort of show. A reclusive girl, a lively active girl, a lively girl who's really suicidal, a friend who's very active in helping you and who will probably fuck most of these girls in the inevitable erotic dojin. Can't say for certain if that's the standard these days, since an anime with the same shit only about disabled people was celebrated like the second coming of Christ, but back in my days this shit was bread and butter of romance anime, which is probably the the reason why it feels so generic. In show's defense, it isn't bad production and story-wise. It's about just what you expect from this genre, with some neat little twists here and there, and a memorable small cast of characters, making it an easily digestible, harmless entertainment if you're into this sort of shows. The graphics and the music are okay, nothing special, with the music being especially generic, to the point where I remember listening to that music in fucking Initial D of all places, but meh, not like people deliberately listen to background music, so who cares? And really now, who cares, auntie? Who cares about these obvious D-list animes that no one in their right mind watches outside of things like you, who obviously don't have a social life and probably barely grasps the concept of it? Well, you know what? You're probably right, dear listener, but unlike you who can click off and go watch anything else at any given moment, I'm stuck here and don't have a choice. And just like current leader of China, if I'm to suffer this all, I'm taking you all with me. Here's a fun piece of observation. Yuri Plisetsky from Yuri on Ice looks similar to Ash Lynx from Banana Fish. Suspiciously similar, I would say. And the same goes for the Doghead boys as well. Next time you watch an anime and think it's homosexual, see if one of the characters is from Kazakhstan. I think that's an obvious indicator. But anyway, enough about Japanese pornographic cartoons. We're here to talk about American pornographic cartoons. The Loud House is an ongoing slice-of-life sitcom show developed by Nickelodeon. The first season has 26 or so episodes, of which I have watched only 18, because eventually it became pretty evident that the show is going to stick to its guns, and well, so do I. The plot of the show is about what you expect from a typical American sitcom. In a typical American city and or suburbia, there lives a titular Loud family in their Loud house, and the story centers around their shenanigans. Our main hero is Lincoln Loud, the only boy in a family of 10 sisters, each of whom follows a distinct character stereotype so obvious that I immediately remembered the Wacky Races, because the character development in both that and the Loud house are roughly the same. Each episode has a befitting pun for a name and a title card, sometimes pretty good, sometimes a bit obnoxious, and goes kinda like this. Lincoln is doing or being forced to do something retarded, and the entire family or one of his sisters gets involved in it. Then typical cartoon comedy happens, they all learn their lesson, how they love each other, and it all ends either with Lincoln narrating the moral of the story, usually something about family ties or slapstick. And honestly, for what the show tries to be, it's actually pretty decent. Yeah, I kinda shat all over it just the previous minute, but I'm not dumb. I understand that this isn't supposed to be some epic story that you tune in to witness to the very end. This is a sitcom. It has generic but decently written characters and generic but useful to know morals. A good, mindless fun for kids and adults alike to watch an episode a day and relax. Nothing more, nothing less. But if I were to stop being a fence-sitter and actually be critical for once, I would say that the Loud House heavily suffers from clichevitis, one of the most dreaded diseases a critic can face. Literally every plot point of every episode I've watched is not just typically cliched and can probably be found in about a dozen shows before that. The age of some of these cliches goes so far as to the early 50s and 60s, and I wasn't making comparison to old Hanna-Barbera cartoons as a joke. Something is seriously wrong in the plot department when I can pinpoint episodes of Tom and Jerry for references. The graphics are fairly nice looking and smooth, but once again remind me of at least a couple similarly animated cartoons. The music is a generic rockish soundtrack that has some alternates, but be prepared to hear the same. Another thing that I personally didn't find to be that obnoxious, but apparently Russians and people of African faith don't like, is that the show... how do I put it? Places two homosexuals as parents for the show's stereotypical main character's friend. I'm not sure why people of Kenya found that so offensive though. So far they were only in 2 episodes, only in one of them did they have an important role, and well, this is a sitcom about children, which means that parents here are either practically non-existent or utterly and irreversibly brain damaged. I was less irritated with them being homosexuals and more irritated with them being the typical hyper-allergic kind family of intellectuals cliche, because heaven forbid we actually be original. That would require effort, and knowing Nickelodeon, they would rather openly support the She-Ra and the Princess of Power is an ongoing cartoon, reboot, remake, rejigger thing based on the mildly known television series She-Ra, Princess of Power, made in 1985, the times where men were men and women were men that could also have babies. And alongside a large number of cartoons either continuing, rebooting, or inspired by old cartoons over the years, She-Ra can certainly claim the privileged title of another one. Come on, auntie, don't be mean to the thing right from the opening. You got at least 3-4 paragraphs left to dump concrete mix of dog poo and vomit onto it. Well, in its defense, at least it tries to be somewhat faithful to the original. This isn't that atrocious Thundercats Go or however the fuck it was called, but unlike Japanese who don't have any problem with making faithful reboots of the thing if they have enough time and money, since the show was made in the late 80s, there's probably at least some parts of this that these days would be considered at best politically incorrect. So instead of
racist and sexist cliches of the 20th century, the show is filled to the brim with racist and sexist cliches from 21st century. Our main protagonist is Adora, the perfect and wonderful teenager who was raised as a foot soldier by the evil Horde, but one time she finds a magical sword in the middle of the forest that tells her that she is in fact not evil, and that convinces her to betray everyone she grew up with and join the rebellion, which rebels against the Horde for... Now that I think about it, why are they even called that? In the original, the Horde actually conquered the entire planet, so the rebellion rebelled against the ruling regime. Here, not only the Horde is pretty much just a regular totalitarian country with design ripped straight out of Futurama or Invader Zim, but the rebellion seemingly consists only of 5 people, 6 if you count Adora, and a couple of princesses who before all this were seemingly pretty okay with just chilling out in their kingdoms while the suspiciously human Horde casually wreaked havoc on the local Volnus populace. But anyway, Adora, now She-Ra, deserts to the rebellion, disappointing her mother and sister slash best friend, and the entire first season they try to either return her to the Horde or kill her off due to personal jealousy. She befriends Glimmer and Bo, the Mako and Bolin to Adora's Korra, and then shenanigans ensue. Painfully rushed shenanigans if you ask me. The story feels pretty patchy, like bits or sometimes even large chunks of it are being skipped over. I think the show officially lost me when my proxy had to take a shit in the middle of episode 10, so I decided to prank him and turn on episode 11 while no one noticed, and to be frank, I only realized we've been watching the wrong episode right after the ending titles when I actually remembered what I did. There's this Inuit looking ice princess that we've only interacted for one episode where she was incredibly unwelcoming to Adora and all of this rebellion nonsense, only for her to just randomly come to her aid in the last episode right out of fucking nowhere and just be all friendly and supportive like she was killed off screen and replaced with a step forward version of her. Which might as well bring us to the graphics and music. Incidentally, how I told you that this is also a gossip cartoon? Yeah, there was apparently some controversy surrounding She-Ra's character design, that she basically looks like a man and therefore is quote-unquote trans. I would probably have something more substantial to say about the matter, but unfortunately phrenology is not my forte, and to me she looks and sounds like a woman for all that's worth. I've also heard that the graphics remind people of budget Avatar, which 1 is insulting to Avatar, and 2 kinda shows the attitude these people have towards cartoons in general. If we're going to compare, the show more reminds me of budget European or Canadian cartoon, like, you know, Winx Club or Wakfu and the likes, but with certain 90s anime influences. Some are obvious, like the Sailor Moon transformation sequence, some are not so much, like the way they draw characters' eyes. I would say it's a bit cheap on the actual animation part, but overall nothing overly outrageous if stuff like Teen Titans and Thundercats get a pass. The music, however, is garbage, especially the opening, which sounds not only generic as fuck, but its lyrics are possibly some of the most laziest lyrics I've heard in a while. It's like the songwriter just browsed some basic feminist slogans on Reddit and made a song out of them. I kinda like the main villains though, and it's nice to see that they've tried to give the Horde some character other than being evil, but that's pretty much the only reason I can see watching the show forward. However, if we're being entirely and totally honest, with all of this said, this show definitely serves its purpose of being mindless casual entertainment, and if I just randomly stumbled upon it on television, I would probably watch it, but I wouldn't count that as a high praise. You could show Pol Pot shagging badgers in a shed on TV, and I would still watch it. Not like other shows are better. Once upon a time, there was a meeting of the Freemason Guild of Writing that proposed that Nordic mythology was the best thing ever made and perfect for adapting into pretty much anything. Unfortunately, the old farts on the left thought that the old Greco-Roman mythology was not only better, but also was more European, while the Anglos over there just really liked their stupid Arthurian mythos and just couldn't let go, and so after a long discussion and several deaths, a compromise was made, and that these 3 are equally great, but the rest are shit, to which everyone stood up, made their Bellamy salute, and went on with their lives. Of course, that story is fictional, Freemasons don't control Hollywood, but once you kinda go critical on cartoons, you'll realize that barring several noteworthy examples, almost all of them either have similarities with Arthurian mythos, the overall Nordic mythos, the occasional Greek and or Roman, or something local if it's made anywhere outside of North America and Western Europe. Gross generalization? Possibly, still irritates me a bit. I for one don't remember anything based on El Cid or the Song of Roland. Heck, if you really stretch it, barely any show these days uses the vast blast of epic stories and mythos humanity left after itself. But I digress. Hilda is a... Jesus, cunt pleffing Christ. Cartoon based on a children's comic of the same name distributed on Netflix. Quite popular one as well, cause people really like it. The plot of the show is, well, pretty much another children's storybook. A blue-haired girl named Hilda lives in a typical Scandinavia land, and the show is about her adventures with her boyfriend and girlfriend. While at it, she meets a lot of weird and mythical Scandinavian beings, dabbles in Scandinavian magic, and have people with non-Scandinavian British accents that are slightly less irritating and coherent than your typical British accent.
There are giants, there are trolls, there are Maras and a random scout group. The only things missing for it to be even more Scandinavian are Huldros and Hilda sucking off dead people to gain superpowers. Also, now that I mention it, a wild girl who spent most of her life in a forest is now forced to move to a posh city and adapt to the new environment while dealing with the old. This somewhat reminds me of Pippi Longstocking, only slightly less pretentious. And that's about it, really. This is one of those bubbly adventure cartoons made for children so that grown-ups can put children on the couch and let them do important grown-up stuff for about an hour or so. It's nice, and I would say adults that don't have their heads stuck up their adult ass will probably enjoy it as well, but it doesn't have a lot of new ideas, not that it has to, it doesn't have a lot of memorable characters, not that it needs to, and doesn't have anything special in terms of graphics, and quite frankly feels safe, and there's nothing wrong with that. I guess one of my employers didn't like that one of the Girl Scouts wears a hijab because of personal reasons, but I personally didn't really care about the looks of a character who only has like 2-4 voice lines for 12 episodes. You know, now that I think about it in a more relaxed state, I can safely sum my opinions about all these scandals and controversies that I saw in cartoons and via mostly dismissal of them. To paraphrase what I've said in Your Name, Ramble, in a story, characters serve as nothing more than pretty window dressers and plot devices. A good story will use all its powers to make us believe in these characters, true, and empathy is an important tool for immersion, but boiled down to basic elements, we're talking about a character A moving to point B to have an event number 45. Because of this, I'm always a bit baffled reading or hearing about such subjective elements like diversity or queer representation in a cartoon, especially when this is the brunt of one's praise, criticism, or marketing. I have to report on this since I want to at least try to be objective about the cartoon and point what people may or may not like about it, but I personally would advise these people to stop being a bunch of snobs and act as if one silly little hijab is the savior or the end of the world as we know it. You can paint the character in any skin color and dress them in any clothing in the world, but if one can describe the story as like something but, this only means that it's just another cartoon, good or bad notwithstanding, and will suffer the same fate as the rest of them. The very least you can do is to accept it and not stink up the internet when I try to do some bloody research. You know, I thought I needed a break from anime, but in actuality it looks like I need a break from YouTube entirely. Maybe it's the hot summer that influences me, or maybe I legitimately would rather go stick a finger up a bear's ass than doing this every week, but I just kind of feel creatively bankrupt, which isn't a good thing when you have to do these things regularly. But anyway, The Dragon Prince is an ongoing 3D action-adventure cartoon developed by Wonderstorm Studio and distributed by Netflix. The plot is typical for Western fantasy, but with a healthy dose of Avatar: The Last Airbender, which is unsurprising, I guess you do what you do best. In a typical fantasy land, magic is derived from 6 elements, but humans, as per usual, can't really do magic, so in a typically human fashion, they've invented the magic of genocide, but the fucking elves weren't really keen on genocide as we humans are, and so they did the most logical thing an elf would do, exiled them on a less magical side of the continent, built a great wall of lava to stop all immigrants from coming, and put a massive fuck-out dragon to guard it. Yes, elves, that's real smart of you. Humans and their genocide magic won't ever hold a grudge against you, you nitwits. Our main heroes are Human Prince Callum, Human Prince Ezran, and a Moonshadow Elf Rayla, who after honestly pretty stereotypical shenanigans team up to deliver the egg of the Dragon Prince where he belongs, all while a typical Jafar is planning to return humanity its Lebensraum. Not gonna lie, I enjoyed this show greatly, predominantly because the show managed to use everything I liked about Avatar and not fucking it up, which is more than I can say for Korra, that's for sure. The characters are written in an enjoyable, morally grey manner where you can clearly see who's the villain of the show, even if you can sympathize with them to some extent. The weakest parts of the show for me were the graphics and the music. The graphics are 3D, which is already not great, but somehow they managed to make it worse by lowering the frame rate to a staggering degree, only upping it in fight scenes and stuff. The music is overall kind of forgettable, typical melodramatic violin and action tracks best characterized by that track SpongeBob used to use. And that's really it. I liked it because it's basically Avatar: The Last Western Fantasy, and it has all the pluses and minuses of modern Western fantasy, including that representation stuff that might get the show banned in Russia and Africa. I've only watched the first season, but I can already predict that Callum is going to be a special little boy because he's the main hero, and that Jafar is going to become more and more unhinged, etc. Predictable, yes, but I've seen worse. Now, I have a feeling that I'm forgetting something. Wonder what? Oh, that's right. You.
There always comes a time in my life where I slowly and painfully realize that I don't really have anything to say about this show that couldn't be said about pretty much most of what I've rambled before. I mean, what can I say about a cartoon whose plot, graphics, and music can be summarized by this screenshot? OK K.O. Let's Be Heroes is an ongoing comedy action series created by Cartoon Network, and it definitely fits there. It tells us about a boy named K.O. who lives in what I can only describe as the USA of My Hero Academia universe and wants to become a hero, and the show's about that and his assortment of friends, frenemies, and all that other stuff. Yep. It has the same strengths and weaknesses as the Loud House and Hilda. The only things that differ are the niches they currently fulfill. It's even kinda ironic that these pretty similar shows are scattered throughout 3 competing channels. If I was a conspiracy man, I would probably start thinking that they're in cahoots. Even the graphics in the show aren't that bad. I'm still not sure if that's just a style or an homage to something, but there were worse cartoons over the years, and the fact that this one is 2D is already an improvement. This is a kid's cartoon. Nothing more, nothing less. My inner kid liked it. My inner adult was bored out of its skull, and that's how things should be as far as I'm concerned. In fact, if you really think about it, if this is what kids watch these days, then you kinda have a stable and healthy ecosystem in Western cartoon industry. All 3 channels have their small exclusives you would like to tune in, and they all are perfectly serviceable and will probably gain a cult following if they're shown for continuous periods of time. Admittedly, I still haven't seen anything Disney Channel made, so maybe it's not as idyllic as one can think, but it's alright. And that's kinda about it, really. Now go away. Now this is the cartoon industry I remember. None of these bland but perfectly serviceable original cartoons with tons of personality and brand recognition. Now we're viewing a bland but adequately made cartoon to which all viewers and critics alike will make the exact same type of reaction. A confused gasp and a shout, "What was even the point in this?" Spirit Riding Free is a 3D cartoon series made by DreamWorks Animation Studios and distributed by Netflix, based on a 2D feature-length cartoon named Spirit, Soul of the Prairies, or Spirit of Cimarron for those who watch us from Burgerland. And just like I said a couple of seconds ago, what was even the point in making this thing? Does anyone even remember this totally average cartoon from times when everyone and their pet cockatoo wanted to become the next Disney and Shrek was only beginning to blow up the way it was? Good to see that desire to mimic Disney is still going strong. It takes effort to copy people so blatantly. But let's not judge a proverbial horse by its price tag. Our story begins on a train where a young girl named Lucky travels to some USA frontier shithole to live because reasons. While being all USA city dwelling and stuff, she meets a wild Mustang named Spirit, who may or may not be Spirit from the film, but since they look the same and even named the same, they might as well be the same damn horse for all I care. Anyway, Lucky and Spirit establish a telepathic connection with each other, and after demonstrating that Spirit can't be tamed by methods allowed in a children's cartoon, they bond and then shenanigans ensue. Well, credit where credit is due, we're talking about a cartoon from an experienced animation studio, so I doubt anyone thought that it's going to be terrible or even bad. The graphics overall are nice and smooth, albeit the models are kinda starting to blend in with all the other Western 3D cartoons I watched. The music is as usually bland, and the opening is probably the second worst opening I've seen this interseasonal. Unlike She-Ra, its lyrics aren't the problem, at least they have some sort of connection with the show. The problem is that it's basic and honestly interchangeable. Seriously, pause this video, go find Spirit opening, close your eyes and try to imagine anything that would fit just as well. I, for example, imagined The Witcher. The problem is that this is a cartoon from an experienced animation studio, which means that for the most part we've all seen this before, done this and that, and ultimately there's no real point in this other than occasionally watch it on TV and be bored while you're at it. Every big studio is guilty of this, but Disney ripoffs, sorry, I meant DreamWorks of late, is especially guilty, as the moment whatever feature-length movie they've made becomes even a bit popular, then it's only a matter of time until some sort of series gonna roll out, and the popular opinion about it would almost always be a big bored shrug. Only at least Puss in Boots and Penguins were somewhat recognizable, and How to Train Your Dragon was boring but kinda connected two cartoons together. The only thing that really saves this one are the girl characters and general aesthetics, which means that the show will probably have a healthy supply of fans and entities on fanfiction.com. And if you think that I like Disney, well, think again, Mr. Big Brain, because Disney is no better. In fact, arguably, Disney is even worse, because its existence allows others to do the same thing it does. In fact, if you really go far, Disney barely had an original idea since it became corporate. First, it was shitty sequels to their stupid movies, then there were shitty cartoon series based on their stupid movies, and now they're making live-action films based on their stupid movies. See you in the next 20 or 40 years, where I'll ramble about officially licensed Disney virtual experience, where you can explore Draken's lair and impregnate Dumbo.
Alright. I'll ramble on this as well. Initially, Spirit was supposed to be at the end of the interseasonal, but what the hell? People from both sectors wanted it, I'm not that opposed to it, since this is Disney and it's been a long time since I've done something my subscribers wanted, so Gravity Falls it is. Gravity Falls is a 2-season long cartoon series created by Disney from which I've watched only 12 episodes, because watch the first episode of this interseasonal, you lazy layabouts. The story is, as per usual, pretty basic. Two twins, Dipper and Mabel Pines, were free-ranged to their uncle on summer vacation in some shithole in Oregon named Gravity Falls. Then Dipper finds a magical journal about magical stuff, and to no one's surprise, shenanigans ensues. It reminds me of Hilda, to some degree at least, only with typical Americana instead of Scandinavia land. Yeah, for the most part, the plot of Gravity Falls is loose. The episodes are connected with each other in that sort of sly way, but if you were to just turn your brain off and watch it as is, you won't miss out much. It's probably for the best to make such a story in a Western environment anyway, as to be frank, Western animation has a bad habit of either being just a bunch of episodes without any connection whatsoever, or these grand epic stories where the narrative is constantly shoved down your throat. The visuals are quite neat, all things considered. They're drawn consistently, so none of that annoying style fluctuation like in KO. The animation is pretty fluid, and the 3D elements are fortunately used quite sparingly. On the other hand, the music was not so impressive. Hilda vibes once again reminded me of themselves, though I suppose since this came earlier, Hilda is the one to blame for copying Gravity Falls' homework. But there are two things that greatly annoyed me: the voice acting and the jokes. I don't know about you, but when I imagine the voice of a 12-year-old boy, I don't imagine my voice only slightly lower pitched. And I also don't imagine a police deputy to sound like a screeching goblin, which is especially disconcerting since they're apparently gay, and that means that eventually, somewhere off screen, one of these two penetrates another, and whoever does it, the deputy will go and that is not a pleasant image to conjure. The jokes are, for the most part, okay. They're divided into slapstick, visual and audio gags, and occasionally pop culture references. The latter being, to be honest, the weakest part of the humor. Any one of us can find slapstick funny, because cartoon violence is funny. Anyone can laugh at the scene where Stan says patronizing things to Gideon while he's suffering from a miniature tickle attack. But references to Street Fighter and old 2012 memes are something that either not everyone will recognize, thus ruining the joke and making an entire episode worthless to some people, or it will look dated, which while cute can also be horribly obnoxious. Overall, I can't say I didn't like it, but I liked it like most shows I rambled about. Like something I can watch on the telly 1 to 2 times a day and then forget all about. Like all of these shows, it will have a stable fan base of people who will draw characters having sex, and for the most part that's their entire value. In the case of Gravity Falls, I'd say it's also a damn good Americana. If you don't like reading, I guess this might as well be the Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn of this generation. So, do I have anything to say about the current cartoon industry overall? Honestly, not really. The style has changed, as well as acceptable personalities, but the problems of it are in many ways the same as they were before, and what the anime industry suffers from as well. They have found a niche, and they will continue to exploit it for all that it's worth until death, only for the industry to suffer a minor recession, reinvent something that will be popular, rinse and repeat. I guess that can be considered a bad thing, but I personally don't mind. After all, everything new is forgotten old.
The opinions I've been hearing on Tate no Yusha have been like opinions about our current politicians, so they're absurdly mixed. I've bent an ear to many who call it one of the best shows of this season, perfectly balanced in its portrayal of characters, and an equal number who call it the worst piece of shit to ever grow off of that godforsaken island of child rapists. But before we even begin, I can tell you this. There are two kinds of cartoons in this burning heap of hate that is our world. Those that were made mainly because the studio wanted to make a lovely thing for everyone to watch, and those that were made because the studio thought it would be a lovely thing to add another floor to CEO's private skyscraper. And I have a strong suspicion that Shield Hero was made with the latter reasoning. How do I know? Because it's an isekai anime. Even looking at the front cover, you can guess what sort of thing this is going to be and what can you expect from it. Might as well call it Rising of the Black-Haired Dude and His Harem of Girls. Rising of the Shield Hero is a 25 5-episode Trapped in Another World anime made by Kinema Citrus about a dude named Naofumi Iwatani who got transported into another world via a light novel as one of the 4 cardinal heroes, aka the overpowered protagonists who are supposed to defeat a bunch of mobs that are spawned from waves of calamity. The story features 2 interesting gimmicks. Each of our 4 heroes comes from a different version of Japan, which makes them and their experience of this world different. Naofumi is a shield hero that is summoned in a country that hates shield hero, and as a result, from the first episode he gets shat on by the king, the heroes, the merchants, why pretty much anyone other than a select few individuals, and that makes him very bitter and hostile to this country. I would say that the story itself isn't that bad, all things considered. The characters' motivations and actions rarely go out of expected things from them. The main hero himself, typically for this sort of genre, is portrayed as cruel in the world, but actually a kind-hearted pragmatic that slowly but surely earns his respect to both his teammates and people around him. The biggest points of contention would probably be how fast everything goes in the narrative. Naofumi gets a ridiculous amount of bullying, to the point where other heroes would have probably left the country by episode 6. In the latter episodes, other heroes get shit for basically one wrong thing they did, which is a bit unfair if you really think about it. People who hated the show often said stuff about slavery and that the hero has no moral troubles with owning slaves, but frankly speaking, these people have probably never read a Japanese light novel before, as that shit is basically the staple of fantasy by now. Admittedly, I can see a point being made about the rashness of our hero, as that isn't very well portrayed up until the latter episodes, where you can see that pretty much all of the heroes are morally flawed and up their own ass. No wonder why before that some people would consider him an unpleasant individual. The graphics are for the most part okay, but getting slightly worse every episode. First it's going to be the weirdly drawn faces that sometimes look like different characters altogether, then there will be 3D that is about as what you expect from Japanese 3D. The music is actually pretty good, if a bit weird at first. It's certainly something I would want to listen to, though I wouldn't say it's overly original, so take my recommendations with a grain of salt. Overall, I would say that I definitely liked Rising of the Shield Hero and would like to see it more. It's not a perfect story, but it's a well-made one, and that's more than enough for me to recommend it. However, if you don't like this specific genre, don't like overly edgy heroes, or just a bit tired of the stereotypical male heroes and their harem of cute girls, then there's little new for you to see here. I suppose the fact that heroes here are worshipped as gods is an interesting idea, but I wouldn't count that as overly original. Just go to North Korea if you want to copy that.
Dear Isekai readers, what is it that you enjoy in these types of stories? I'm dead serious here, no irony or anything. What the actual fuck do you find in these works that the Japs just keep insisting on adapting every goddamn season? Now okay, that was a bit harsh. Let me explain. I'm probably in the minority here, but I, apparently unlike most others, seek a little bit of a different experience from any given Trapped in Another World story. My ideal isekai would probably be something like this. In a world where the dark forces are rising to conspire against the civilized world, that very world summons heroes from another world to help them at the very least gather some sort of stability. But because of one single fuck-up, the ritual is botched, and instead of appearing as a warrior, our protagonist is either trapped or a lonely scribe from a church, or even as an attendant for an envoy. Or would they be called messengers these days? No matter. So instead of fighting heroic battles, our protagonist would be learning languages and how to do rituals, speak properly in different languages, and deal with courtly and priestly intrigue. The various church ideologies, noble factions, and subtle differences in body language that can make or break a very tense peace negotiation. I'd rather watch a well-executed battle of wits than the now commonplace epic battles of epic epicness that are not only done to death at this point, but even parodied to death as well. What I mean to say here is that whatever the fuck this anime is doing, it certainly doesn't meet my desires. Kenja no Mago is a 12-episode Trapped in Another World anime produced by Studio Silverlink that tells the story of an orphan boy named Shin, whose parents have died from a demon attack that's found and raised by an old man named Merlin Wolfold, along with his slew of friends and ex-wife. After a decade of living in the woods, Shin grows into a handsome teenager and then suddenly realizes that all his life he was trained by pretty much the best people in the kingdom, including the king himself. But because he's got no knowledge of the outside world, the king decides to enlist him into a magical Japanese school that just so happens to be called an academy, where he starts kicking ass and marrying wenches. Wait a minute, why haven't you mentioned the isekai part of this isekai? How inquisitive of you, my dear viewer. And simultaneously, I too wonder, where is the isekai in this one? Yes, Shin is, in reality, a reincarnation of a person from our world, which also somehow explains why his magic is stronger than that of the others from this world. While others loudly imagine how a log burns, Shin imagines the process of burning from the start, which makes for stronger magic. Other than that, there's no reason for this to be an isekai. In fact, fact, have thought of at the very least 3 ways to explain his super abilities without ever mentioning planet Earth. Guess the genre is so popular you have to at least pretend to be part of it, otherwise you won't even get adapted. But I digress. For the most part, the plot is what you'd expect of a typical fantasy anime, including the protagonist that's super strong, super experienced, and gets to know every single powerful individual in his kingdom. Basically, if you've ever seen a regular at Magic High School, or to some extent, Kill la Kill, you'll probably get used to this anime fairly quickly. At the same time, though, it's more mature in some aspects than its contemporaries. The hero isn't an ungodly Gary Stu, his powers merely give him a head start. The girl he's interested in not only loves him in return, but they get some significant romantic development, and the supportive characters actually provide moral and emotional support instead of simply being comic relief. The visuals are decent and the music is pretty average for a fantasy anime, but with various memorable moments, and even some tracks that would be nice to listen to separately, although I personally would swap the opening and ending, but hey, that's just me. Overall, while I wouldn't say it's a bad anime, it's not a great one either. As far as isekais go, I'd say this one's about on the same level as Overlord on a budget. Nice, but overall nothing special. And why the hell this is an isekai, I'll never know.
Oh, look what the, commies, I suppose, brought us. An anime that is not an isekai! Color me shocked, ladies and gentlemen. Though, considering the previous anime, maybe the main heroine of the story was actually one of those mythical women shut-ins I constantly keep hearing about. But the anime doesn't want to tell us about it for fear of sparking a socialist revolution. Fairy Gone is a 12-episode original anime made by PA Works, and it's pretty much every action dark fantasy anime story ever told in the early 2000s. Don't believe me? Let me break it down for you. In a world that suspiciously looks like the late 19th to early 20th century Europe, local Bismarck finally had enough and unified the shit out of his home continent of Eastol. 10 years after it, the now unified Zestia suffers from being very incompetent at what it's trying to achieve. But let's be honest, people, that's all background flavor text as we focus on our main heroine. A lone girl who, for most of her life, was very unlucky, apparently, and now she suddenly gets possessed by a fairy, and because of this gets recruited into the special anti-fairy forces. Then suddenly everyone and their dog around them have super special fairy powers that, along with our character moping about her very hard life, is pretty much the story in a nutshell. There are some other subplots in the story, but honestly speaking, they're either inconsequential or poorly explained at best. For example, the fairy tomes. Fairy tomes are tomes of knowledge on everything about the fairies, aka local magical MacGuffin, do not steal, and a big chunk of the plot is devoted to collecting these pieces of old toilet paper like it's something very important. Yet, you know what the titular black fairy tome deals with? Fairy possession, aka the thing that previously stated was totally impossible and barely known until our main heroine done it in the first episode. And that basically broke my suspension of disbelief right and proper, as not only the thing everyone claims is impossible is so possible, in fact, some fuck wrote on a book 300 years ago, but you're also trying to convince me that this thing is so fucking valuable, the mafia and the local ministry of magic of all things is fighting for it, even though this makes fuck all sense considering that putting some fairy scrotum in the person is infinitely easier than forcing a fairy to rape someone into becoming their stand. The graphics are actually pretty good, though it's unsurprising, of course, for a studio that made Sirius the Jaeger. The music is made mostly out of bombastic rock tracks that certainly leave an impression, but eventually start to feel like you're in some music video more than an actual anime. You know, I feel like the age of long-ass shonen animes has finally ended. Yes, One Piece is still going strong, and yes, I bet there is at least one anime right now that's still going and doesn't plan to stop, but overall, it's all now dumbed down to 12 or 25, if you're lucky, episodes, and for some animes, that amount of episodes is just not enough. This anime has potential. No, really, I'm serious. When I wasn't bored to death, I felt the same pleasant vibes I felt back in the day when I was watching, say, D. Greyman or Soul Eater. But those two animes had something Fairy Gone lacks, and simply put, that's time. If it was a 50 to 70 episode anime, it would have the necessary time to shape its characters in the world, explain its factions, desires, and stories, thus making their actions mean meaningful and impactful for the viewer, and currently there's none of that. Other than our main pair of cocks and vaginas, there was no characters who were more than just their looks, and when one of them died, spoilers ahoy by the way, I was struggling to not fall asleep. Like, who are you people? One was only seen once before talking like a douchebag to another douchebag, while the other was only active in the episode he's getting killed. So, you know, talk about anticlimactic, hey folks? This anime reeks of a rush job, like the studio developed this whole thing while being high on heroin, which would explain why they decided to split the previously 24 episode anime into 12. The good parts only last for a couple of hours anyway, and you get used to it fairly quickly. Which is a big shame, really, because I feel like now that the big three has finally been reduced to one grandpa that refuses to die out of spite, we kinda need something that would, if not take their place, at the very least give us that serialized feeling. AKA, why all of you motherfuckers watched Game of Thrones even though you knew it's gonna end miserably like the rest of them. Hell, this and Sirius the Jaeger would work nice as some sort of shared universe sort of deal. Yet the closest we have to that these days is cunt-flapping JoJo, and Fairy Gone and all the others were so much as a wet fart with varying levels of diarrhea. Basically, what I'm trying to get across is this. Watching Fairy Gone is like reading about the Haitian Revolution. Sad, miserable, and absolutely pointless in the long run.
Well, 3 animes down, a fuck more to go, and as per usual, there's a lot in my list that with my patented stoic form of storytelling could be accurately summarized in a passage or two, and so let's start with stuff I have no desire to talk about more than I have to. I should probably make a jingle for that. First on our list is Isekai Quartet, a short-format 12-episode anime about characters from ReZero, Konosuba, Overlord, and Saga of Tanya the Evil sitting in a typical Japanese school and duke it out. Again. Some serial killers wish they would have that lasting effect on people's consciousness as Japanese schools apparently have on Japanese, because the fuckers are everywhere starting from the late 70s and no one seems to care, mind, or go to a therapy and show where exactly did the principal touch them. I initially hoped to be seriously disappointed in Isekai Quartet, because from the get-go it reeked pandering, and that's one thing I hate on the same level as Rasolnik, but in the end I left disappointed but also mildly impressed, as the core humor of the show is less your favorite characters are getting themselves into stupid situations, and more your favorite characters experience stupid situations while being in character. Fairly impressive how true to their stories they've got, especially in regards to Subaru, who out of all of them is probably the hardest to utilize without everyone around him dying. So if you've watched all of these shows and have a fond memory of them, then this would be a pleasant time waster while you wait for their respective next seasons, but I have a hard time imagining anyone else liking it, as without understanding the context or lore behind the characters, it's pretty much a meaningless chibi, or however the fuck you call this sticker-style graphics, school comedy, and if I wanted that, I could go watch Puka or something. And speaking of watching Puka, One Punch Man Season 2 went live, and it pretty much has the same problems I rambled about in the first season, only even worse. The plot is divided into 2 parts that occasionally collide with each other. Monsters are rallying to a super monster in order to conquer humanity once and for all, and one dude named Garo basically wants to become a hero hunter, and for that reason he beats the shit out of heroes. There's also Saitama in there, but that's not really that important, because finally the Caped Baldy, or however the fuck he's called, has been relegated to the overriding deus ex machina that he is. And that's a problem, but also something you should have expected. Each hero has a storyline. Garo's teacher is trying to kill his student for his own sake, monsters are making terror attacks left and right, and Garo himself is a sympathetic character who oozes charisma and confidence that he proves by beating even the hardest of enemies, and yes, I suppose it is impressive that the author managed to give every one of them a clearly defined personality and portray drama, but Saitama and subsequently the story doesn't seem to give 2 shits, and frankly, I sympathize. Whatever Shmaro or that martial artist is going to do, none of it matters, and that's not saying much about Saitama himself, a character that the show tries to make sympathetic and deep and kinda having the same arc as Mob, but it's made by the same author, so it's not that surprising, but it's impossible to care about him because A, he has the personality of a frozen block of jello, and B, like one of my coworkers said on a vampire hunting session, there are no fucking stakes! Why should I give a shit about anything here if I know how it ultimately ends? Why do you think I would be interested motivated to watch other characters in an anime called One Punch Man, especially when all that titular One Punch Man wants is sit on his ass in various locations and play video games all day. But ultimately I am but a little speck of reason in the vast ocean of short attention span that is today's anime viewer. If you don't really care that much about the story, then I can say that the battles have gotten even more epic, the music is just as well made as before, so if you just want senseless action, then this anime is right up your alley. Not sure if I would want to invite someone like you to my vampire hunting session, but you do you. Amidst all the horrible events of our bleak and depressing world that like an ever-hungry machine devours our cheerful youth and spits out dry, emotionless husks, struggling to compete for competition's sake, it's unsurprising that more and more people choose escapism in whatever myriads of way it may manifest before you. Be it drugs, gambling, gaming, or collecting cacti, it's all being made in the name of escaping at least for a bit from our joyless reality, but the most insidious thing happens when escapism gets industrialized, because then you're basically stuck in an unending feedback loop of serving people who just want to be left alone in their fantasy land, and this anime is a prime example of this. Sabayaki Kitsune no Senko-san is a 12-episode wish fulfillment simulator anime made by people who created Umaru-chan that was generously described to me as Dragon Maid with Fox Girls, and that's pretty much the only reason I even agreed to watch this thing in the first place. It tells us a story about a very depressed office worker who is so depressed, depression had started to gather into black clouds behind him, so to prevent him from start stabbing people or making an elaborate terror attack, a Fox Girl waifu is dispatched to provide emotional support. Then everything kinda goes like in Dragon Maid, they bond, have fun, new characters are introduced, albeit in a fewer number, he's getting slightly better, only for the waifu to disappear in the end, and then reappear, and then an open, happily ever after ending that gives creators the possibility to make a sequel should it be needed happens. It's been a while since an anime made me legitimately depressed. Like Dragon Maid. Pah! Not like it's a wrong statement, but it's kinda like saying a smartphone is the exact same thing as a rotary telephone. If we're being pedantic, yes, but I doubt a rotary telephone can play music or act as a vibrator. The same here. Dragon Maid was a comedic story about a depressed office worker and her lusty dragon maid. Senko the Kitsune is a story about a depressed office worker where occasionally a comedy happens, almost like it's contractually obliged to do so. But the final nail in the coffin was that thing in the end, you know, the Super Senko time that's basically like one of those waifu games where the fucking character fucking talks to you in fucking first person with all those cutesy fucking things, and the only thing that's missing from it is the actual fucking part. It's a small part of an anime, skippable even, but it says a lot about the supposed target audience, and that they're so alone and desperate they can only talk to a drawn animation of a fox girl would be a bit distressing if I genuinely gave a crap. But I digress. Other than the bleak message of it all, on a technical level, the anime is alright. Nothing overly special in the graphics part, nothing overly special in the music either, other than reliance on the word mofu, which is a word I never heard before, and from what I could gather it's basically a combination of moko and fua, and it's used to describe something soft, light, and fluffy, especially small animals. You learn something new every day. In fact, if you just watch it with your brain turned off, you can easily skip the bleakness of it all and just watch a mediocre cutesy anime about a dude obsessed with fluffing tails to the point where it kinda starts getting unhealthy. The character of Senko is pretty well written, she's easy to bond with, and though slightly generic for my tastes, I can perfectly understand why people would like her. Failing that, you also have other female characters that generally are of little relevance, but their looks are designed to appeal to some demographics, and without poking it any further, this is pretty much what you get out of it. So either depression or an unimpressed yawn. Kinda like penises if you really think about it. With some variations, the wise anime scholars acknowledge 3 types of harem animes: the cunt-curbing, the cock-blocking, and porn, and these days it's actually not that easy to find a pure-blood harem anime of any variety, predominantly because the line between a harem anime and everything else is so blurred these days it turned into a palm tree and crabs are stealing its coconuts! But I digress. Bokudachi wa Benkyou ga Dekinai, or Bokuben, which is a funny name because it makes me imagine a small boy named Ben, is a 12-episode harem anime developed by Studio Silver and Arwo Animation. The breed of this harem anime is pure cunt-curbing, as it has all the necessary requirements. Our main hero is an oblivious, lovable doofus whose defining characteristic is that he is painstakingly average in studies, and that's enough for the principal to hire him as a tutor for 3 girls who are the best at one particular thing while sucking hard in other things, and that other thing is what they actually want
want to do. Teachers usually call a scenario like that the horror, but as time goes on, he turns out to be quite good at tutoring, all while the girls slowly but surely come to terms with the fact that it's not their chosen subjects they should be sucking hard, all while our hero is slowly but surely gathers a herd of girls with varying levels of romantic interest to him. Well, okay, I'm being a bit facetious here. Besides being a doofus whose reaction to girls is borderline PTSD, he also comes from a poor family, something that guides his personality and motivations, all while the girls are distinct enough personality-wise that you're kinda invested in them, but distinct doesn't mean unique, and if you watched more than 4 anime in the last 5 or so years, their personalities start to be very predictable very fast, and when the new girls were introduced, I had a distinct feeling that by doing so, the author declared the previous girls' storylines to be explored enough, got bored, and decided to play with a new set of Barbie dolls instead, and that realization had killed any motivation I had to continue watching this anime, and so I stopped at episode 11, rose hungrily and dazzled into a brand new world, and then I realized that the biggest problem with harem model of storytelling is that the experience is ultimately anticlimactic. Allow me to grope your imagination, so to say. What is the biggest advantage of an isekai? It can be many things, but a chunk of you might say that it is similar to fantasy genre, an infinite number of possibilities, stories, and worlds to explore that could all be explained through the eyes of someone who is as alien to this world as we are. But what is the biggest advantage of a purely harem story? I'd wager that there's not a lot of it that couldn't be just as well implemented in other genres just as efficiently, and that's ultimately what killed harem animes in this day and age. Pure harems don't give you that sense of satisfaction that comes from watching a protagonist overcoming a difficult challenge, or closure that a good action story can make, or a love that a well-crafted comedy is able to provide. All they can indulge you with is a set of balanced Barbie dolls for the protagonist to use. It's nice to add that into something as a spice, but on its own your interest just gradually peters out and stops. Here, I'll show you what I mean. What's the first thing that actually comes to your mind when seeing letters DRR? My first thought is donkeys riding rhinos, but in actuality this is how you could abbreviate the title of today's anime, Dororo, which I find hilariously easy to mock relentlessly. Guess it's my jingoism towards Japanese speaking again. Dororo is a 24-episode dark action anime made by MAPPA and Tetsuka Productions, which is not the same as Dororo, a 1969 epic action anime made by Mushi Production based on manga called Dororo, created by Osamu Tezuka, who is to manga what Brexit is to English nationalists. It tells us a story about Dororo and Hyakimaru, two relatively young people who travel through a roughly medieval Japan if it was designed by a pessimist on a quest to kill a lot of demons. One hides a tragic story of betrayal, suffering, and death of his loved ones, while the other can't tell his tragic story of betrayal and suffering because demons ate his hands, legs, eyes, nose, vocal cords, and spine, and the only thing that keeps him alive is his sheer unrelenting anger, making him basically the primogenitor of every brooding but surprisingly competent emo character you see in every anime and manga ever devised. And that's pretty much it. See, back in the day we didn't need a lot to impress us. All we needed was characters we could reasonably give a crap about and a lot of murder, and for what it's worth, modern Dororo gives us just that. Two characters walking in samey Japanese environments, murdering the ever-living fuck out of everything that is stupid enough to get in their way, and that's a good thing. That's pretty much why Afro Samurai and Hellsing are so popular. Yes, the story is a bit more complex than just an angry person and his pet boy walking around slashing demons, but that's the beauty of it. You can sit all day enjoying the pretty well executed character drama, or you can watch Hyakimaru slicing someone's genitals off and you won't miss a lot. I suppose I should probably compare the two, but honestly there's no real point in it. It's kinda like Hellsing or Full Metal Alchemist in that the latter adaptation is generally more faithful to the source than the first one, but the first one had its interesting moments, and the only ones who would be interested in arguing over quality are the nerdy purists whose black wrinkly hearts can't fathom the idea of being a moderate. As for me personally, I like the new Dororo more than the old Dororo, mainly because Hyakimaru doesn't talk for the first half of the show and the retarded dog is gone, but that's just me. The graphics are generally well made, but the visual design is a bit samey, not sure if it's an homage or cheapness. There are roughly 2 episodes taking place in a dilapidated temple, and I swear to gods they're identical to each other, to the point where I first saw the second one I thought they made a big circle. The music is, for a lack of a better term, tolerable. It's no epic rock guitars from Fairy Gun, but the traditional Japanese instruments combined with traditional orchestra and choir are able to neatly convey the tone of the scene, but as well made as they aren't overly original and will inevitably blur in tons of similar sounding songs of other anime, save for something like 12 Demons, which will neatly lie in the same place Akatsuki teams from Naruto and Nier lie. So to summarize, do I like Dororo? Yes. Can I recommend Dororo to other people?
Yes, but only if you want to see some samurai and demon action, cause otherwise there's no point in watching this over tons of other action anime. I might even say that it goes a bit against modern action anime conventions by people actually fighting and ending fights quickly, so no one is yelling their special attacks or suddenly unlocking secret second wins and such. It's a small feature, greatly boosted by graphics and gore, but it's also the thing that can ruin your experience of the show if you're actually one of the people who like all the yelling and talking, as battles can begin and end ridiculously quickly, to the point where you can only process some of them after the fact, which to some can be very anticlimactic. Will I stop adding more rows to the name? Yeah, I'm kinda bored of it already. I guess I'll stop now. Nah.
So you people wanted me to talk about video games this interseasonal, and I obliged like a good servant of the proletariat, but what exactly should I talk about? Unlike anime YouTube, that's more or less secluded from the rest, or the film critic YouTube, where everyone is more incestuous than the Habsburg dynasty, there's no end to people talking about video games in all sorts of formats. Short, long, old, new, with scores, with politics, covered in cream and served cold. There's not a lot of niches possible to carve in this market, and those that weren't still carved are either very hard to do right, or are like that for a good reason. But this is for what? 3-5 episodes? I'll just talk about games I've played recently, and that's all. So the first in our list is Zanzara: The Hidden Portal, a game made in 2002 by Phonetics Development, a German studio best known for Settlers 2 and Cultures, which is kinda like Settlers, only not really, and this game could just as well be described as kinda like Pokemon, only not really. Once upon a time, a girl from London named Amy was cursed by a goblin and or her own stupidity into teleporting into another world named Zanzara that's currently dying, though for all I know the goblin just wanted to have a wife or something. After briefly explaining that the world is fucked and only she can save it, she goes on a grand and epic adventure of bumming around the world searching for artifacts that the local retards lost somewhere and ultimately opening the bridge between our worlds, allowing fairies to run havoc on Earth, though we get the rune to return back to our world pretty easy, so why didn't she just return back and tossed the rune to that place as far away as possible, or remained in the world and married the goblin is anyone's guess. On her way she is thwarted by the Dark Elves, or as I like to call them, Dark Crystal rejects, and one character betrays us, though honestly it's not that big of a spoiler. When you look like a mix between Saruman and a pedophile, the connotations kinda come automatically. Anyway, the gameplay of this game is Pokemon. You go around the world, collect and train various fairies, and these fairies evolve into better fairies, and occasionally you need to use one type of fairy to open previously closed areas. Simple enough. What makes it different from Pokemon is the battle system. In Pokemon you're fighting in turn-based combat, while here you're fighting other fairies in an arena shooter Quake style, which is fun and could get pretty tense when you and enemy fairies are on equal playing field, but other than that there's little difference in everything else. Like Pokemon, this game isn't exactly very hard or challenging. All fairies have an element they're strong against and an element they're weak against, and you have to find the most optimal 5 fairies to use and use them against everything. Once you get that all-star team, nothing can really touch you, and what can touch you usually dies after a try or two. It's a very zen game, perfect to whip up some podcast and listen to it while you're leveling up your fairies, but just like with Pokemon, the satisfaction of killing someone in one hit is buried under a ton of nits that eventually form one giant nit that covers the entirety of the room. First, unlike Pokemon, there are no free healing places, so it's entirely possible to be seriously mangled by some encounter, ran out of potions, and then teleport to the nearest city to heal, and then march back where you were. Then you have random encounters of varying levels of irritation. Sometimes they don't come when you need them, other times there's no end of the bastards burning through your potions and forcing you to teleport back to cities. Then there is death. Yes, you technically can die in this game once you ran out of fairies, though I still fail to understand what's the bloody point of that, especially when the game doesn't establish the rules in a clear manner. And with every fight you get the same animation where the enemy fairy either ambushes you or spins around a bit and then goes to this screen that has fuck all meaning or importance, as passive effects in this game are a total joke and the best they can do is to mildly annoy you or kill you instantly. And even the collecting part is kinda fucked because the local Pokédex only records fairies you own, not the ones you've catched. So the second your nature hooker evolves into an advanced nature hooker, best you have a spare one of those, or it's back to frantically catching one, you miserable completionist twat. And the sex distribution between fairies is not only random but a tad pointless if you really think about it. Pokemons are supposed to be animals, so giving them sex and sometimes even sexual dimorphism is logical, as we assume that to make more Pokemon, a mama Pokemon and a papa Pokemon have to bump uglies with each other. And unless you're going to tell me that Ice Queen over here is regularly dicked by polar bears, there's not much reason in this other than to cross a check mark. But let's end this before I go on a tangent. If you're one of those weird people who religiously play, watch and masturbate to everything Pokemon related, then don't play this game. But if you want to play Pokemon but don't really like the turn-based combat or just intimidated by the sheer size of it, then Zanzera is the perfect game for you. Personally, I use this game when I want to listen to a podcast, so essentially I place it on the same spot as Counter-Strike or anal probing. One of the biggest advantages of global warming is that summer and autumn now are for the most part the same in most parts of the world, not just some, which is a great thing if you don't want to leave your apartment and play Mount and Blade. Mount and Blade is a very famous game where you take control of some clueless fuckwit whose job is to bumble around the wilderness until you either become king of the whole world or get bored, uninstall the game and start doing something productive with your time. It's like Minecraft or Dwarf Fortress or Space Station 13 or Eve, a game every self-respecting gamer knows about and maybe even played for a bit, but most people just can't wrap their heads around it, partially due to community being a very positive place of sunshine and rainbows, partially because it's one of those games where you have to craft your own amusement 90% of the time and people would rather be gang raped by a herd of walruses than think for themselves. But I digress. Because just rambling on the vanilla game would be a bit counterproductive, I've decided to actually embrace my bilinguality and play a Ukrainian mod, which to my biggest surprise wasn't shit. Honor and Glory, or in local sprach Chesty Slava, is a pretty simple mod for Mount and Blade set in the Livonian time period of Eastern Europe, an interesting and fairly unresearched part of both Baltic and Russian history in which we are to make a name for ourselves. I decided to create a female character predominantly because I like challenge and overcoming medieval prejudice, but also because playing a woman always felt incomplete. For all the guff it says about medieval prejudice and such, the levels of sexism you encounter in this game are fairly tame, and outside of boobs and in some mods the opportunity to be raped, gameplay as a woman rarely differs from that of a man. Even in marriage, the only real difference between sexes is that males have to go through memorizing poems and all that other shit, while all a woman has to do is to pester a lord enough until he gives up, and that's pretty much it. Your husband isn't going to lock you up in a castle, the political options are pretty much the same, and you can only marry nobles, which to me is the most offensive part of it all. So what, I can't just go to some village, marry myself to a pretty boy and have 5-6 children with him while occasionally going on an anti-bandit raid? So anyway, I've created my Cora, made her a pious orthodox girl from a common peasant family, and dumped her in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. I chose Intellect Charisma set for this game, predominantly because I wanted my army to basically be immortal on later levels, and partially because of trading, aka the best way to earn money in this game outside of owning a village or two. Here's how it works. You dump at least 3 points into trading and start gathering information on prices. Then you take the item, sell where it told you so, and soon enough you'll be swimming in cash. It's especially good if you're doing a mercenary only run, because in this mod rescuing peasants is useless as they can't be upgraded into anything useful, and the mercenaries, while good at what they're doing, cost a ridiculous amount of money compared to bandits or regular faction troops. Thankfully, due to historical oppression from Swedes, the city of Helsingfors had a problem with rampant alcoholism, which allowed me to rake lots of cash from just selling them wine and horilka for a couple of months straight. Then I got bored from trading, navigating buggy Riga, and doing quests for nobles and guild masters. Incidentally, whoever designed those tracking quests should be murdered with a rusty spoon, and decided to hire a lot of Lithuanians, train them a bit, and murder some Crimeans. Unfortunately, cavalry is still ridiculously overpowered in this game, so my first foray with the Lord, while wasn't disastrous, still made me unable to take part in the campaign for a bloody long time. Which is why I want to talk about the battles in this mod. They are great. They've managed to implement spike and short era weaponry pretty well, and no faction feels too under or overpowered. It's usual for a mod to eventually devolve into nothing but elite spam, or you amassing the fattest cavalry in the land and steamrolling anyone who looks at you funny. Here, not so much. For the most part, because you can't reliably recruit from villages without grinding their reputation, and so you'll get used to military camps and their guards that scream at you surrender or die. Because I only had a week to play, I haven't tested all of them, so who knows, maybe Prussians and their advanced muskets or Livonians with their knights indeed murder anything and everyone, but so far I have tried Lithuanians, Ottomans, Moldovans and Cossacks, and I have to say that I liked Moldova mostly due to their aesthetics and surprising tanking capabilities, and despised playing as Ottomans because barring higher levels they don't have anything even resembling heavy armor, which means they'll drop dead or unconscious faster than a virgin on a porn shoot. I want to play Crimeans next to see if they have that script that makes light cavalry's AI less retarded than in vanilla. So can I recommend this mod? Pretty much, yes. It's by Fire and Sword that plays more like vanilla with not a lot of changes to the formula and some pretty decent new clothing and such. But if you want something more original or fantasy, then I doubt this mod will provide you that, as for the most part it's pretty tame. Autumn Blade in general is pretty tame. It's hard to say anything coherent about it because it's not a game you necessarily play, but rather it's a game you put on the background, occasionally checking to see if you've reached your destination and cheating AI. Though fun as it is to be an actual part of the battle, it quickly becomes tedious, and other parts of the game are either rudimentary or require mods in order to keep them at least somewhat challenging, and that's not a good thing. Imagine if I said the same about my sex life. Boy, would that make me look sad and pathetic. Oh boy, people are getting tired of battle royales and returning back to Minecraft! You know what that means? Yes, you do! Time to try riding the trend wave and ramble about Minetest! Yeah, you heard me right. There's not a lot you can say about Minecraft these days. It wasn't already talked to death by every single YouTuber who gave a shit about it. In comparison, Minetest is fairly unheard of on YouTube. Might as well be original in that regard. So Minetest is a free open-source voxel game engine, or in layman's terms, like Minecraft but. The but is that it embraced the spirit of old pre-Microsoft Minecraft and markets itself more as a game engine than a game, if you get my drift. Which is why if you download it and try playing in single player, you'll have roughly the same experience as from those Minecraft alphas when the game was barely a game. Now you have to kinda tweak the game for your liking, which means that installing or creating mods will be your main source of entertainment. Fortunately, the game was coded in Lua as opposed to Minecraft's Java and has its own API, which means that installing and deleting mods in Minetest is easy compared to Minecraft, and other players don't have to have your Minecraft build in order to play on your server. And speaking of servers, it's time I tell you a story. Once upon a time, my employer wanted to play some Minecraft, but none wanted to actually de-anonymize themselves and fork cash for it, so he installed Minetest instead and asked if I wanted to join, and I agreed, cause not like I had other things to do at the moment, and so after getting the hang of controls, we've tried finding a place we can call home. Several attempts and running away from invincible killer ducks later, we've landed on a server quite originally called Airfusel's server, where we stayed since. Now, I generally don't like playing multiplayer games with other people because my experience with them usually falls into one of two broad experiences. One, literally every player beside me have abandoned all pretense of life outside of this game and have etched controls into muscle memory, so even if they don't spew racism in the chat or generally act like dicks, I never feel like I'm accomplishing something, and if I wanted to feel inadequate, I could have visited any local graveyard. Two, every player around you has the rough intelligence of a toddler on methamphetamines, so while you can rack victories pretty easy, the value of these victories are lower than Venezuelan Bolivar, and you get bored. Thankfully, Minetest and the sandbox games in general have one big advantage over any other type of game, in that they can be played in any way by virtually any people as long as you adjust your expectations accordingly, and I enjoy nothing more in these kinds of social games than to run away into the most unexplored or rarely visited corners of the world, bunker down, lay booby traps, and take pot shots at anyone daring to be near me, basically the local version of Switzerland. And so after roughly 4-6 in-game days of searching, we've found a place relatively remote from all the action, built a simple hut, and from that point on started to actually play the game. Now, what do you do in Minetest? You build. You build a lot. That's kinda what I've started to do, creating an entire city and several villages with bits of lore and such scattered around the place, while my employer basically dug a big hole in the ground and then built a massive tower into the sky, possibly to commemorate his own Willy. Then you also can do PvP and such, but I generally found it to be a pointless thing on a server such as Airfusel's. See, here we have a level system. The higher your level, the higher your health and damage, but the death penalties are also quite severe, to the point where dying on high levels can instantly delete months of grinding and even lower your level should you be unlucky enough. So I just avoided PvP and other players altogether, basically having my employer do most of the social stuff while I was busy building shit. Like Mountain Blade, Minetest is a game best played when you have a set of goals to do. Just randomly creating shit gets boring fast, but making a structured city or a massive tower into the sky will never get boring, predominantly because unlike Minecraft, the height of the world is either very high or adjustable by the server's owner, so when Minecraft has only a measly altitude of 256 blocks total, Earth's world alone has something like 15,000 blocks in the sky and 15,152 blocks underground, so you'll have enough places to hide or build whatever your heart's desire. If I were to point something I don't like about the game, it would probably be the overall sandbox approach to it. I'm a story creature at the end of the day, and as much as it's fun to craft your own story, to me it's equally fun to participate in the story of the world as well, and unlike Minecraft, Minetest is very lacking in that department. The world feels barren and empty, with no NPC villagers to nurture or harass, no temples to plunder, no bosses to kill. Even mods don't really help with that, as the modding community, though doing well, isn't nearly as big as Minecraft's, which might turn off any veteran Minecraft players from the game, or those who would like something weird or magical like Thaumcraft or Ether or something else. The game overall also feels a bit clunkier, especially in enemy hitboxes. Here's server made best with it by essentially making them box-like, but without the ability to tweak this, you'll be stuck in a world with hard-to-kill mobs and birds that are practically invincible without high-level gear. But anyway, do I feel like it's flawed? It's a good type of flawed. The one where it's easy to get used to, ignore or fix flaws by yourself rather than getting annoyed by them constantly, and my recommendation would be this. Go play Minecraft if you want an adventure, go play Minetest if you want to have fun. And though I'm currently alone, I personally still continue playing on Universal server, partially because I'm like a swan that marries only once and never has another mate ever again, partially due to sunken cost fallacy.
Before I started doing this all, I've always wondered, why save for Total Biscuit's popular video game YouTubers rarely if ever cover strategy games? And while thinking on how should I start this ramble, I've come to realize exactly why no one seems to talk about them. And that there's really nothing to talk about. Yes, even less than about your average modern third-person shooter. All RTS are the same. If you boil them down to basics, you build, you win, you build again. The gimmicks are the only things that can differentiate them, for better or worse, and that's not a good thing. Oh yeah, I forgot. Age of Empires 3, Wars of Liberty. Age of Empires 3 is the third game in the Age of Empires franchise, a franchise best known for its second installment, with everything else being either mediocre or dead. Age of Empires belonged to Warcraft-style school of RTS design, though the main difference from Warcraft is that every faction plays pretty much the same, but there's one unique unit and bonus percentages, unique for each faction. Fucking innovation up the ass, if you ask me. It and Rise of Nations were a shining example of that time in RTS, when everyone wanted to become a real-time civilization, with features like trading, dynamic alliances, and all that other junk, perfect for playing with friends, but mostly pointless in single player. Yes, I don't like the second game that much. It had nice ideas like active projectiles, and the trading system was generally entertaining, if a bit simple, but personally my favorite game in this series is Age of Empires 3, partially because it pretends to cover a topic rarely used in RTS, partially due to several ideas it had, like minor tribal camps and such. Admittedly, it was also the game that deleted a lot of what made Age of Empires unique, but I personally had much more fun playing it in single player, unlocking various cards and decorating my little screen, disregarding the pretty weak AI and that the overall feeling of the factions was pretty anachronistic, especially Russia, that fights 17th century Europe with 15th century roster. And this is where Wars of Liberty comes into play. Wars of Liberty, alongside Improvement Mod and Napoleonic Wars, is one of the best known mods for the game, and for a good reason. Whereas Improvement Mod balances the game more and Napoleonic Wars add a new timeline and factions, Wars of Liberty tries to do both, changing the game and adding a ton of new factions, some of which were never even used in RTS or barely if ever covered by games in general. Like all other Americans, for all intents and purposes, this mod can pretty much count as an unofficial expansion of sorts, as of this recording it's still in active development, which on one hand is a good thing, on the other hand might make this video absolute down the line, when devs decides to add space Martians into the game or something. But anyway, Wars of Liberty improves on the original by adding new gimmicks into the game, as well as grouping factions into several templates. I've leveled up a lot of factions already, so I wanted to try something new, and for that I've choose the Ottomans, cause why not? Yes, I'm happy to say that the Ottomans don't really plays that differently from vanilla. Their main gimmick is that they automatically spawn villages and have access to the best artillery in the game. And while the latter part isn't true, the former baffled me even in vanilla. Kinda weird seeing that feature in Ottomans, wouldn't it better for Germans, who were pretty much like cockroaches during Age of Sail? But stay mechanical, auntie, stay mechanical. The building process feels nice, and they've basically made all building styles I can think of, besides auto-build Scorch style, though I like the improvement mod better in that regard. Solely thanks to killer trade routes that could be used as a passive defense mechanism. The factions overall feel a bit chaotic within their own templates. South American natives especially come to mind in that regard, with notable mention going to Peru, whose gameplay felt really weird compared to other South Americans. Romanians that overall felt weaker than the rest. Yes, even Greece, who is a 1C pony, but at least they have Marines and Malta. Or as I like to call them, Age of Empires 2, the faction. I did like other additions to the game, though when they work as intended, that's it. Not sure if it's a bug or a feature, but as of this version, no African native buildings were working properly, and some maps feel over-designed, like the Galapagos Islands. But even with all the things I dislike about the game, I still find it hard to yell at it too much. They're doing their best. Age of Empires 3 isn't that mod friendly, and honestly speaking, for a mod, the team have done a remarkable job of keeping things fresh and interesting, while not reinventing the wheel in terms of core gameplay loops. And if you like Age of Empires 3, then this mod is pretty good addition to the formula. But how should I put it? This is a capybara. It looks like a fat nutria. This is a nutria. It looks like a big rat. And this is a rat. It looks like a small nutria. That's all I have to say on the matter.
Since this is the last thing in this interseasonal, I wanted to cover something else I liked to play yet people don't know about, and after thinking on it for a bit I thought, you know what? Why not talk about one of my most favorite Warcraft maps? Fourth War. Yes, in case if you still haven't realized it by now, welcome to my channel, where I mostly ramble about animes and don't really play games all that often. How nice of you to visit me. I guess I have to start with some introductions, but what can I even say about Warcraft 3? It's one of the most popular RTS in the world. It's one of the genre-defying RTSs. It's the thing that first Dota ran on. It's the thing that is set in the same universe that Energy Vampire World of Warcraft is set in, and for many a post-USSR folk, this and Counter-Strike were probably the first games they ever played mods for. You'd have to be either very young or really dense to not ever hear about at least one of those things, which is a testament to both Blizzard's quality and their hypnotic powers. But why a map of all things? Well, this requires a bit of a layman explanation. One of the biggest reasons why Warcraft 3, or any other game for that matter, continues to be played for decades is the ease with which it can be modded, and Warcraft 3 has quite a flexible map editor with just another script syntax able to do a lot of peculiar stuff as long as you knew how to use it, which is why the modding community for the game grew exponentially, diverging into its own genres and eventually even into their own games. You had tower defenses for people wanting to roleplay as North Korea, you had Aeons of Strife for people who wanted to play RTSs but couldn't be bothered to actually learn how to play them. You had RPGs for people who couldn't afford whatever Elder Scrolls or Final Fantasy was back in the day, and ORPGs for when you ran out of money for your WoW subscription. You even had maps roughly analogous to YouTube poop and even movies made entirely on the engine. But the map I want to talk about is in a peculiar genre called Melee, which were essentially custom RTS maps with new stuff added in them. Fourth War is a map made by a Ukrainian and Russian language, because of course it is, it was made before 2014, set in an alternate Azeroth, roughly based on some books from the Warcraft universe, though with how bloated their catalog become over the years, these books could either be non-canon or fanfictions. What remained of Illidan's faction after events of Warcraft 3 bunkered down on Ashenvale instead of running away. The Scourge is waging a full-on frontal assault in every direction, but instead of brooding in his tower, Malygos decided to actually use his authority and unite all races of Northrend into a force that could stop the Scourge once and for all. The Alliance and the Horde were reforged into new technologically advanced factions, and what remains of the Burning Crusade is planning to make a desperate final stand. The map has 10 factions, with gameplay ranging from not that different to regular vanilla to quite a bit different to regular vanilla, yet even in the most radical of factions, the main gameplay is still recognizably Warcraft 3. You gather golden wood, you build buildings, you have to do everything fast or else even the easiest AI will take your lunch money and laugh at your pitiable managing skills. But each faction has something something different. You choose the new alliance and you suddenly have to choose a baseline of humans, dwarves or night elves and then invite another race as a support troop, thus having 9 possible combinations to choose from. You choose Draenei and you can choose between powerful anti-undead legions of bravery that require a third resource to function, or the broken Draenei who like to be stealthy. And that's the best part of it. To this day I haven't seen a melee map of such scale, the one that does things differently enough to be worth playing, but not so different that you're wondering why even bother making the same map and not a mod or even its own game. There is a bit of a modder bloat. The last version of the map shows that the person who made it was slowly getting too big for Jazz, and that's probably why he stopped developing it ultimately. I would recommend it, but honestly speaking, I'm not sure how. His site is either dead or long since abandoned to spam bots. It's Russian only, which means that without a Russian language patch you won't have any descriptions, and if you'll have them you won't understand them if you don't know Russian. But if none of those are a problem and you'll be able to download it, feel free to enjoy it. God knows it's better than what Blizzard's currently doing with Warcraft. And speaking of that, with current news about Blizzard and the fact that I probably won't have the time to speak on this topic otherwise, I might as well comment on what I think about all of this. In recent years, gaming has become quite a different beast from what I remember it to be. Gamers are still the beating boy of every political, social and moral busybody out there, but they themselves have gotten significantly more aggressive and defensive of their hobby, partially because eventually even the most broken animal will run out of patience, partially because gaming itself has become quite a lucrative industry, kinda like that nerdy boy you bullied at school turned multi-billionaire. But now we are in a situation every other industry is in. Customers are getting piddled on by big corporations, while the big corporations themselves are so out of touch with what their fans actually want, they think they're doing them a favor, and not like I can blame them for it. A typical Sony or Activision isn't just one office in rural America, it's a big bloated thing with multiple offices all over the world, each governed by locals with agendas allowed by the place they're in, which is why American Blizzard has no problem with advertising LGBT stuff in their games, while Chinese Blizzard vows to defend Chinese sovereignty. Outside of Baltics, ex-USSR Battle.net is governed from an office based in Russia, so riddle me this, dear listener. If a Ukrainian gamer will shout or wear something that doesn't support Russian illegal occupation of Crimea on a local Blizzard-sponsored event, do you think he won't get the same treatment as that Hong Konger when Russia is known to nationalize anything even remotely supporting that sort of stuff? But then again, I've stopped caring what Blizzard or any other major company's been doing a long time ago. They're not even beating a dead horse at this point. The horse has been grinded into bone dust somewhere in 2008, and now they're beating a half-dead donkey since it's cheaper and donkeys are usually more sturdier than horses. Blizzards, Valves, and other Paradox Gamings of this world haven't done anything that could interest me in a while, and what they have done is usually either a blander version of a much more tastier previous meal or about as stacked as a Disneyland built on a Nazi concentration camp. To me, all major Western franchises are dead, and if they'll ever convince me otherwise, I will make a face reveal video, convert to Buddhism, and fuck a dead pig. Finally, free from video games! Now back to the eternal hell that is anime, and holy fucking hell, 15 of the bloody things. As much as I know you like to torture me, I'm very adjusted to that, so the only one who'll suffer will be you, and whatever gormless bastard watches this dreck. To the Abandoned Sacred Beasts is the recent installment in the ever-living genre of pseudo-historical action animes that I feel recently has gotten much more attention, possibly due to Saga of Tanya the Evil or Princess Principal. And its contribution to the formula and the subgenre is roughly the same as our current president's contribution to international stability. On the surface, the plot and the formula hasn't changed much. A girly girl protagonist and a burly boy protagonist bumble fucking around the place in search of quests while something vaguely historical and or political is happening in the background. So why did this anime felt like a sloppy rushed blowjob? Maybe it's just me who's wrong about it. Maybe Dororo set my expectations too high, so whatever anime was first on my hit list would inevitably feel inadequate. But anyway, our story starts in the continent of Patria, where the industrial north and the proud southern miners are locked in a devastating civil war in which the North loses quite horribly until they invent these sacred beasts, which are basically different versions of werewolf, snake, dragon, etc. And with their help they are slowly winning the war, but everyone in the army treats them like shit because, well, as we all know, treating the only reason why you are winning this damned war in the first place like shit is the best way to ensure obedience from them. But before the last battle, a betrayal occurs. Not gonna spoil it, but please take a a wild guess who betrays them, and our main hero awakens after a 2-month coma to realize that the North won the war and everyone in his squad have gone mad and are wreaking havoc on the local populace, and so he decides to murder all of them before they can do something totally stupid. Again, maybe Fairy Gone, Violet Evergarden and all the rest have ruined this genre for me, cause I swear the last time I was quite disoffended by the plot's execution was when I was watching Gungrave. You wanna know the precise moment this anime lost me? It was first minute in, when the show had started showing a now typical war is hell scene, more reminiscent of the First World War than the American Civil War it's based on, and just when the dude we were observing was getting all the typical shell shock, we see these bastards dressed in all white as if they all came from some Kingdom Hearts fanfiction with swords, lances and shit, and start murdering everyone as if we were watching some early JoJo. Instantly all possible care I had for the world and characters fizzled away because the anime had blown its load in the first episode and I knew the plot armor would keep everyone else alive until needed. And the cherry on top of this smelly cake was the hamstringed romance, when a female character is so visually similar to our protagonist's quote-unquote dead girlfriend that even the main villain got angry about it, which was about as cliched as you can get with this sort of plot. The graphics are generic. While they're not the worst I've seen, they're also far from the best, being your standard lower tier animation and design, just serviceable enough to get a pass but not nearly good enough to be even worth a notice, and the music is bland and forgettable as you would expect, but I still can't get over the plot of this anime. You know what's the most disrespectful about it all? The way they've portrayed the North, aka the side you're supposed to be, if not rooting for, then at least give a shit. And I'm sorry, what's there to love about them? The best military strategy their commanders have shown so far was a full-scale frontal assault on the opponent, hoping to gods enough men would survive to overcome the enemy's defenses. No wonder they were losing miserably to the south, and then when they've created the perfect soldiers for said assault that could reasonably defeat their enemy, what do? They treat them like shit and start killing the second they go out of control. And to top it all off, they're not afraid to do whatever it takes to achieve victory and write it off as necessary casualties while their taxpayers die. So please tell me, why should I root for them and their quest to kill all sacred beasts and not root for the free nation of Patria, who for all their wrongdoings weren't shown in such a bad light? And speaking of a bad light, our girl character, the strong and independent but meek and feeble girl protagonist, slowly falling in love in our burly werewolf for reasons I still can't understand unless his manly chest releases pheromones that affect all purple-haired girls in the vicinity. Before this, no character could topple Chise in the spot for the most useless female protagonist I've covered in this show, but I swear to God, Shao came dangerously close to that, with her being essentially just a crux for Hank to keep his humanity. I'm even tempted to read the manga for this, just to see if she is useless in the source as she is in the anime, so I guess I owe some congratulations to the anime. It made me want to check the source so I can slap it even harder. Guess you win this round. To the abandoned sacred beasts, more like to the abandoned sense of self-worth.
Never thought it would be this early on, but I have 14 animes to go through, so I have to be as concise as possible. Time for people's favorite Sino Deta Tabmo, and on today's topic we have the animes with unnecessary long names that are hard to pronounce. This and the weird pauses in the middle of the character's delivery are the bane of my existence as an anime viewer. Quite irritating it is, yet me saying anything about them would be me essentially nitpicking for the sake of it. A very petty and masturbatory practice, if you ask me. But since I've already started talking about it, might as well get it out of my chest. All of these long names are just telling the premise of the story, presumably because the readers or viewers had too many vaccinations and the autism kicked in prematurely. And it's usually not that bad or horrible, and people usually short the name anyway, like with Bokuben or Konosuba, but I don't like this practice, because it really feels demeaning to me for some reason. Imagine Western movies or books having the same naming tradition. Instead of Goethe's Faust, you would read a book about a dude who made a deal with the devil and acts like a retard. And instead of Star Wars, people would go watch a movie with space samurai where the main hero gets his hand chopped off. And as for unnecessary pauses in the middle of the delivery, they are short, but very noticeable, if you get my drift. If it's for my daughter, I even defeat a demon lord. No, it's not a declaration, as the anime's title is a 12-episode slice-of-life anime story developed by Maho Film about an adventurer who adopts a demon girl he found in the forest and pampers her to his heart's content. That's pretty much it. The rest of it was spoiled anyway. The sole point of this anime is to evoke a basic reaction of adoration, or in simpler terms, DAW! As far as I can see, it does the job pretty well. It all strongly reminds me of animes of
early 2000s up to that weird eye positioning on characters' faces, and that's probably one of the reasons I liked it, but the other reason why is its world building. It's not overly unique, all things considered, but I much enjoyed the way show explained all of its lore. Mainly that it's not over-reliant on pathos and uses core scenes very sparingly. It's a slice of life through and through, but unlike something like Konosuba, it's of a slower, relaxed pace, with neat cultural stuff and background information sprinkled in. Don't expect anything else from it though, as this is a slice of life anime. They're not known for their action scenes. And speaking of not expecting much, Do You Love Your Mom and Her 2-Hit Multi-Target Attacks is another 12-episode anime with the premise being the show's title. A company in Japan had basically created the most perfect MMO game of them all, where the tech behind it alone would probably revolutionize our world. So what are they doing with it? Making a massive roleplay game so that mothers and sons could bond with each other. Yeah, the author couldn't even be fucked to make a lazy isekai this time, but that's not why we are here today. Our main hero is Mamako Osuki, mother to Masato Osuki, whose basic point is to serve as the perfect mother. I think they're called MILF these days. And the plot revolves around mom jokes, actions involving moms, and general light-toned comedy. Kinda like Konosuba if Aqua was the only character worth a shit in the entirety of the show. You might think that I'm angry at this show, but in all honestly I was bored out of my mind, as this is some of the most formulaic Japanese comedies I've seen in a long while. If you watched more than 6 animes this year, you'll have a pretty good idea on where the show's going and how the plot will move. If you're like me, you'll start repeating the lines way before the characters will speak them and hate yourself for it. I did like the last episode, but I'm not sure if it was genuinely good or I was so done with life I would have probably liked fucking my own mom at that point just to stop my suffering. And speaking of fucking, here, I'll give you 4 screenshots. Most of them are from the anime, but one of them is from porn. Take a wild guess which one. And that's the crux of most jokes here. The only reason why this couldn't just as well be porn is because women in real life have more balls in their bodies than Masato, something his entourage is probably very irritated by. The graphics and the music are average for this generation, but a bit on the cheaper side, thank god without 3D. I could probably say something else about it, but frankly, I've stopped giving a shit, and so should you. Now I'm going to douse myself in chili pepper and jump on the nearest woman or child I can find here. Just because I can. This week's See No de Totamo is about comedies once again, although this time they're not just simple comedies, but thematic comedies, aka advertisements for people with ADHD. Our 2 guest stars are You Lost, a 12-episode short-ish anime made by Zola about surviving on an uninhabitable island, and How Heavy Are Rambles You Lift, a 12-episode anime made by Doga Kobo about fitness and, Are You Lost? First episode pretty much describes what comedy this is going to be. After surviving a plane crash, 3 girls and 1 Bear Grylls in a skirt swim towards an uninhabited island and try to survive there. By surviving, I mean Bear Grylls is telling them what to do, while the rest 3 are acting stupid, spoiled, or sometimes actively suicidal, with occasional erotic jokes sprinkled in for good measure. Thank god there weren't any men survivors with them, because with the amount of bleeding those 3 produced, it wouldn't take long until someone got their teeth kicked in. But I do admit that as the show went on, the characters grew on me. Though personality-wise they stay the same as their Wikipedia descriptions, throughout the show they learn to make compromises with their beliefs, as well as showing other important aspects of their personalities that make them more endearing to the viewer. The show's comedy is also mostly thematic. Each weird or erotic situation explains one survival thing or another, and though it doesn't revolutionize Japanese comedy or anything, each situation is placed strategically and doesn't go for too long. Overall, I liked it, though I do have to wonder why nobody is searching for them outside of Bear Grylls is dead. But moving on, Dumbbells is a part comedy, part instruction manual for bodybuilding and fitness, and that's pretty much it. If you thought Are You Lost doesn't go beyond Wikipedia descriptions in regards to their characters, I've seen Soviet propaganda cartoons with more to say than this one, and yes, I personally didn't enjoy this anime too much, though I'm not sure how much of it is the anime's fault itself, and how much of it because I've watched it immediately after Do You Love Your Mom. I have to say, on a technical level, there's not much wrong with it. The graphics and music are generic for this sort of show, but it does its purpose. The characters are also generic, but they serve their roles pretty well. The show in itself does its PSA job pretty adequately, and for all it's worth, the character of Macho-san is both visually interesting to look at and character-wise pretty well designed, something that a lot of these educational animes either lack at all or can easily be perverted. Heck, even the obligatory foreign girl cliché has a bit more character, with Russian words sprinkled in her conversations. I know it sounds small, but trust me, Japanese
often couldn't be bothered even with that. It's just that comedies in general, especially erotic comedies, are just not for me. You can only laugh at girls stuck in erotic situations for so long before it starts to be either grating or a prelude. And the humor of dumbbells got stale pretty quickly. About 2 episodes per character and I've already seen everything the show has to offer humor-wise. Which is why I like Are You Lost more. Their episodes are half as short and manage to be twice as substantive, partially because unlike Bells for Dummies, Bear Grylls doesn't overstay its welcome, partially because there are less characters in it, which gives them time to develop and for the viewer to emphasize with them in equal measure. I cared more about Asuka Suzumori plight than Satomi Tachibana's one, in simpler terms, and maybe that's my fault, but ultimately that's just how I felt. So to summarize, both animes are pretty good as long as you adjust your expectations accordingly, but I personally liked Are You Lost more, while Dumbbells would probably have much freakier porn made on it. Finally, a non-comedy anime! Thank fuck! There's only so much I can say about Japanese comedies before it starts sounding like an advice on which studio to burn next. So now it's time to talk about Kochoki Wakaki Nobunaga, an original historical anime based on Oda Nobunaga's teenage years and his rise to power. You know, I'm starting to get why this season there are so much animes for me to watch. You'd think 15 animes would be a lot, but in actuality there's not a lot you can say about them, and what you can say usually ain't that much different from either a Wikipedia description or some pretentious Mal commentator who thinks he's the next Noel Birch. The only way my impressions would differ is by me describing how I personally felt on the show, and I'm a bit conflicted on that. It's been a while since I've felt this fulfilled yet bored at the same time. The story is, well, pretty much what I've described. Young Nobunaga is considered a moron by literally everyone around him, and he slowly but surely murders and bribes his way to being one of the best military commanders in Japanese history. My knowledge on Nobunaga's early life is a bit rusty, but as far as I can say, everything was done pretty faithfully, if not to the history itself, then to the popular legends and representations of it. Yes, Nobunaga's legal wife is usually portrayed as a badass ninja assassin who can go toe-to-toe against 5-6 armed men. Yes, Nobunaga himself was known to wear weird and outlandish dresses. Yes, gay stuff wasn't as uncommon or weird back in the day. In fact, this is pretty much an anime made for me. It doesn't go overboard with its story and treats its subjects with respect it deserves. Yet I can't really recommend this anime to most anime watchers. I think the best comparison would be Gone with the Wind or Titanic for younger folk. By all means a nice story that requires a certain mood to be properly invested in. With said mood, you'll enjoy the anime immensely, as this is a pretty nice drama, all things considered. Without it, however, you'll get bored pretty quickly. The graphics are cheap, which is especially noticeable whenever the show is obligated to show more than 4 moving things on the screen. The character design strongly reminds me of shoujo novels. The music is barely there. The drama is very Japanese, unsurprisingly, but can be a bit weird for Western audiences. I should probably end it by saying it's like Game of Thrones, only competent, but that would be an insult to the anime, so you'll have to go without an end joke this time. So this week I was supposed to ramble on an anime called Great Pretender, but to my surprise I haven't found such an anime. In fact, the only evidence that this anime even exists is a Mal article with fun topics that I'm too am wondering. So I was thinking on whether to make this sort of a gag ramble or not, but then I found another anime I had to ramble about, and it was porn. So, Great Pretender or porn? Pretender or porn? Yubisaki Kara no Honki no Netsujo Osana Najimi wa Shouboshi is an 8-episode short anime developed by Studio Mauso about porn. It's the show that is roughly 6 minutes long, only 4 of those are devolved to actual anime while the rest is end titles. The plot of the anime is pretty straightforward. Our main protagonist, who from this point I'll call Vagina, has a big fire in her apartment and she is rescued by her childhood friend who we will call Chad Firecock. Chad Firecock is interested in our Vagina both romantically and sexually, and after inviting her to temporarily live in his apartment, he starts sexually molesting her, with her meekly resisting, mind you, until they all fuck a lot and then live happily ever after. The end. Not sure why they had to stretch this all out to 8 episodes, and why almost all fucking sites I've searched this show on never bothered to just edit this thing into one episode and upload it that way. It would probably save both viewers' times and servers' memory. Mind you, it's not like I wasn't having fun with the show, though I'm not sure if I had this fun with the show or at show's expense. I initially thought this was going to be a yaoi anime, because the title cover I usually saw wasn't screaming straight hentai to me, and the male characters themselves are drawn in a slightly feminine manner, typical for yaoi, but as the show progressed, I realized that this is just your average modern hentai, and there's nothing really much to say about modern hentai, or porn for that matter. It does the job, you can masturbate to it, but nothing more. The plot is very banal for these sorts of shows, the graphics are cheap but average, with severe lack of visible man nipples and sometimes quite entertaining faces. There was one office scene where Chad molests Vagina in the locker room, and we have a frame where she's coming while he looks visibly annoyed by that fact, and for some reason I found that hilarious. But then again, that's just how hentai works these days. Hentai is like rock or punk music. It has a reputation of being quirky, weird, and risque because of some notable bands back in the day who were basically known for making tolerable music and acting like dickheads, but those times are long since gone, and modern rock and punk scene is either dead or so toothless fucking K-pop artists look daring in comparison, and those bastards will probably soon be genetically grown in a vat, that's how plastic they are. And that's not saying that for one broke as helm there are always 10 million back alley group of wannabes trying and failing miserably. Same with hentai. It gained a reputation for weird and fetishistic shit real life porn back in the day couldn't even dare to think about, let alone recreate. Yet these days, and even back in the day, it's just that people tend to remember stuff like Bible Black more than Advanced Tina, the vast majority of hentai is based on probably some of the most vanilla shit you could imagine, with all the boring and banal cliches and quirks you can expect. All the fun stuff, the infamous stuff, it's all in the print, and it will probably either never be adapted or will be adapted horribly. Looking at you, Pandra. Whether it's for the best or not is ultimately not up to me to decide, but stuff like this anime is the main reason why I try to avoid talking about porn on this show. Not only is it boring to watch, but about as fulfilling to describe as watching a piece of bread with margarine for the next 15 or so minutes. Looks like we're slowly but surely going to the big hitters of this season, as most of what remains by now are animes that a lot of people heard about. Neat! Demon Slayer is a 26-episode shonen anime developed by UFO Table based on one of the most popular recent mangas from Shonen Jump, and frankly, it shows. Somewhere in the early 20th century Japan, there's a boy named Kamado Tanjiro who lives on a mountain with his family of charcoal makers and does all the manly household stuff like trading his family wares and such. But one day he leaves his house only to later find that his entire family was brutally massacred by something save for one person, his sister Netsuko, that he promptly tries to deliver to a local hospital, but surprising no one, Nezuko turns out to be infected by some sort of demon cancer, and after an epic but short duel with a demon exterminator, it appears that Netsuko's love for her brother is literally stronger than basic instincts of her race, which leads Tanjiro and Netsuko on an epic quest to find a cure for her and murder a lot of weird shit. Remember back in my Fairy Gone ramble, I was lamenting on how these days animes lack some sort of really notable big three replacements? Well, I'm happy to say that this anime is exactly what I both meant and wanted to see all this time. A decently made, albeit average shonen anime. Allow me to elaborate. The plot of this anime is simple and pretty much like every shonen story ever told. There's a secret good and evil organization that battles each other since the dawn of time or something? Check. There's a magical bullshit that is basically superpowers that both of these organizations either fight for or utilize? Check. A group of super powerful big shots exists whose sole purpose is to look epic and occasionally kill something? Check. Main protagonist is a kind-hearted pumpkin? Check. His entourage consists of colorful and quirky characters, one of which is a girl? Check. All the girls are conventionally attractive, while the boys have only 2 sets of personalities? Check. But what I've just described are but structural components of a shonen anime, just simply having them would make a shonen good. A good shonen is a combination of an interesting and visually stimulating art style, an adequately explained world and villains, and a clear message of importance of mastering your skills. The latter in general is a defining feature of Japanese animation, really, as most of them tell you that one has to dedicate himself fully to his craft and own it like a sword every day. A message I generally find to be a positive one, and the reason why we have animes dedicated to making bread, driving tanks, and operating a Venetian gondola on Mars. The art style and graphics of this anime are gorgeous to look at, even though the characters were a bit hard to get used to, because every single one of them has a 1,000-yard stare that made me feel slightly uncomfortable whenever they looked directly at the camera. There is 3D, but it's actually one of the best uses of 3D I've seen, to the point where most of it you'll only spot if deliberately looking for it. The world these characters inhabit is also a peculiar one, as it is set in Taisho era of Japanese history, and maybe I'm going to sound a bit over the top here, but this is for the best, as it allows epic sword fights and traditionalist beliefs alongside with new styles and technologies, thus making sure it always stays interesting in terms of powers and abilities. The characters are also nice, if a bit over the top. I guess the most annoying one is going to be the one that constantly screams all the goddamn time, but frankly, so far he's a comic relief character for the most part, and you don't really expect much from them until their obligatory arc where they grow balls. And speaking of obligatory, I guess there's no real point in avoiding it,
it, the show is very by the book when it comes to the plot. If you watched The Greyman, Soul Eater, or any other shonen, you'll probably get into the show really fast, which might suck for those who seek something unique or new. Heck, they even finished the anime on an arc where they, a super elite dude on their side, and a powerful elite enemy are stuck in the same place. Anyone who watched shonens will know what this means. It means that the show raises the stakes by killing off a very powerful ally. Where have I seen this before, I wonder? But other than this, and that the music is kinda lame, this is indeed a nice anime, a good shonen, and something that I genuinely recommend watching, until the fans inevitably turn it into shit by forcing too much bullshit into it. Have you ever noticed that the term power fantasy is becoming increasingly more derogatory than it used to? That and misattributed as well. It pains me that some people like to call various stuff as male power fantasy or female power fantasy, as those things, while do exist, are quite rare, because for the most part, people make power fantasies for a specific demographic, and sex is a very shitty way to classify a demographic, with it being basically the lowest common denominator. For example, think on what some people think as an average male power fantasy. A buff, 8-pack hulk of a man with a big sword and a big-titted wench near him, but I'm more than certain at least 3 people from my audience will go, well, wait a gosh darn minute, this isn't what I want to be. I want to be something else. And that's my point. People don't have a universal power fantasy. They have fantasies according to their age, culture, desires, and taboos. Hence why older people wish to be a mafia member, more than 30 to 40-year-olds want to become a typical 80s action hero, and millennials want to be Rick from Rick and Morty. Arifureta from Commonplace to World's Strongest is a 13-episode isekai harem anime developed by White Fox and Asread about Nagumo Hajime, a Chunibyu power fantasy, only this time played as seriously as humanly possible. The plot premise is simple. An entire class of Japanese school children was transported into a fantasy world, and our hero gets the most basic bitch class possible, that of a crafter, which in turn makes him a victim of constant ridicule and spite. Then, during a dungeon raid, one especially spiteful classmate targets a magical bolt at him and drops him in the unexplored parts of the dungeon. There, after having his hand eaten by a bear, he develops an edgy personality and starts being, let's call it quite liberal with his abilities, creating revolvers and other gunpowder-based weaponry in a medieval sort of world. And you get the drill by now, really. It's basically the other quarter of isekai stories, the ones that don't give their protagonists superpowers from the get-go, but the result is ultimately the same. The plot suffers from the same things Fairy Gun suffers, in that its pacing is all over the place, and sometimes I think the show is deliberately taking the piss. The first episode immediately throws us into the thick of it. Nothing explained, and what's explained is done in the most haphazard way possible. Who are we? The weakest of heroes. Where are we? A fantasy kingdom. How did we came here? A god sent you. They use you away. Now stop asking stupid questions and get disillusioned by life, you stupid Japanese twat. Initially, I thought that it's going to be a sort of 2-element story. One part focuses on Hajime's survival in the dungeon, while the other is about the rest of his classmates trying to cope and get stronger, but that plot is almost immediately defenestrated and never seen again until the finale. The latter parts of the show aren't getting any better, as first half of it is meandering about in one dungeon, while afterwards they skip almost 1-2 story arcs worth of development in 3 episodes, making some additions to the story feel at best obligatory, at worst undesired, the hero's harem being a peculiar mix of both. The graphics are surprisingly cheap, with 3D being the worst offender, though trust me, the drawings aren't any better. Whoever in White Fox is responsible for 3D modeling should be fired into the sun at worst, or at best never be used outside of miscellaneous background. They did the same shit with Goblin Slayer, only at least in Goblin Slayer they had the brain power to turn off the blur from their models. Here they look as if these dungeons have a dedicated team of stylists. If there is something I did like, it's the music and the overall design of the characters. Combined, it for some reason strongly reminded me of a cheap Devil May Cry clone. And come to think of it, Hajime wouldn't look out of place in a Devil May Cry game either. Unfortunately, design-wise, Hajime feels out of place compared to his class and later additions to his harem, but then again he started looking out of place the second he created a revolver in a fantasy world. Unfortunately, in regards to harem, Yue, the first girl, has the most chemistry with our main hero, partially because she had the biggest amount of screen time, partially because other girls either feel underutilized or are basically one-note characters you've seen in other animes by this this point. Sometimes the music can start a bit out of place tone-wise as well, but overall it's a nice action soundtrack to listen to, if a bit inappropriate within the setting in my opinion. Overall I had fun watching it, but I can't exactly say I enjoyed it or can recommend in an unironic fashion. This is a very cheaply made, poorly paced edge-fest of an anime, created if not for a quick buck, then by people who had very little respect for the source material, provided that the source material wasn't as abysmal. If you really want to see the anime, I would suggest watching only till episode 5, as that feels most complete, and then either forget about it until the inevitable second season, or go watch Devil May Cry anime instead. Astra Lost in Space is a 12-episode sci-fi anime developed by Studio Lerche in 2019. Not to be confused with Lost in Space, an 83-episode American sci-fi show developed by 20th Century Fox Television in 1965, as they are not in the same universe. Although, stuff like this is kind of the reason why I originally preferred to call it in Japanese names instead of localized English. There's always a chance of some fuckery like this, and then I have to either call it Astra or abbreviate. None of this would be a thing if I just had the choice to call it Kanato no Astra and be done with it, but no! English-speaking people are dumb. Their reptilian brains just couldn't comprehend the insane complexity of Japanese, and now I have to think how to make sure people searching for the 2018 remake of Lost in Space won't randomly find this video. But I digress. Space Lost in Astra is a science fiction anime, which is always a fun topic, as science fiction these days either tries to be as needlessly realistic as possible or might as well just be called science fantasy and be done with it. This anime falls into the second category more, typical for Japanese sci-fi really, so don't expect 2001 A Space Odyssey or Interstellar here. But it's okay as long as the plot is engaging, right? Oh, that's right. The plot. Well, you know the drill by now, people. Spoiler alert, Arya Stark is the bastard child of Voldemort. Spoiler alert. Now then... Okay, now I have to take you back to 1962. You see, the Cuban Missile Crisis is This is the year 2063. People can travel to other planets freely, but the story technically doesn't have a main hero. Every single one of them is a hero in his own right. So they encounter a black space anus, which they obviously wanted to dodge because why won't you? Everyone loves space anus. And so they acquire a spaceship, but now hiking through 5 planets... Yes, because taking off your helmets in an unknown environment is a brilliant idea, you fucking But wait, genius. It appears that their parents were But then he finds a gun and... Oh, that's right. Guns are banned in this universe because of course it's Japanese. How the fuck do these emu-looking things survive or look like that in 085? But wait, she's actually not a massive bitch, she just has temper issues. But then we find that he is intersexual on a planet of intersexuals. How thematic. But then they're all clones. Hey, remember that stuff about Cuban Missile Crisis? Well, forget about it. So they interrogate this Russian girl and find out that in actuality this is... But remember that enemy I mentioned? Well, he is revealed to be... the Earth gets killed by an asteroid which puts the Earth into new ice. So the clone of a king wants to bang the clone of king's daughter because... Communism! And that is why Puerto Rico should not become a part of the United States. That's about it, really. Yeah, the plot can roughly be described as incredible tales. The more we go, the more incredible these tales get. Now, to the show's credit, it's not that hard to follow the story once you get used to the narrative, but my problem with it is that every single episode there is a plot twist, and it kind of becomes hard to track if you binge watch it. Unfortunately, the biggest problem of the plot isn't even the fact that it puts some Hollywood directors to shame in the amount of mystery boxes and plot twists, it's the fact that they're so obviously telegraphed it kinda makes the plot twists a bit irrelevant. There was one scene where an influential politician and a father of one of the protagonists was asked about the fate of his child, and his delivery was so wooden and sterile you'd have to be severely brain damaged in order to not get the gist. The graphics are fine, somewhere on the upper scale of mediocrity, and science fiction parts are a joke. This might as well be fantasy with how it treats the topic, but it's not a bad thing, really, even if a bit disappointing. The music is forgettable, honestly. Not even the opening stuck with me. Overall, I had a fun ride with the anime, but I can't really say I liked it, mostly because it's too fast-paced for its plot twists to work and too abrupt for the mystery boxes to flourish. As usually, such a series would greatly benefit from at least 1-2 filler episodes that could ease the tension a bit and build character development, but without it, it feels like your average early 90s science fiction on fast forward.
Bam, surprisingly, is not an anime adaptation of late Flintstones, it's not even sure what you're supposed to call it. A reimagining of the late 60s anime humanoid monster Bam. Not that you'll get to see it, probably. I've never watched the original, so for the sake of fairness I tried to search for it and only found the 2006 remake voiced by what I can only assume to be the same people who done Ghost Stories, but even that, according to Wikipedia, this isn't that far off the original, and if so, this is going to be a long one. In the grim darkness of the human condition that is strongly reminiscent of both a typical American and Japanese big cities combined, humans are divided between the richer and snobbier downtown and the poorer suburbs where humans are regularly killed by mutants. But these mutants have a nasty surprise coming for them, for three immortal beings, Bem, Bella, and Bello took it upon themselves to protect humanity in hopes of becoming humans themselves. Will our heroes be accepted by human society, or will they be forever shunned by the xenophobic masses? Stay tuned. Same BAM time, same BAM channel. Yeah, the plot is, for a lack of a better term, cliched as fuck. It goes with the usual serious anime for serious people route of making everything go dramatic and grim, sometimes for no reason other than just doing it. Note that on its own it's not bad though. There's not a lot of characters to take notice, each of them plays an important role in the story, are visually distinct, and the main protagonists themselves are sympathetic enough that most people will root for them. The graphics and the graphical design is nice, but as I've mentioned cliched, the 3D isn't as noticeable, though sometimes can be jarring, the music wasn't as bad, that forgettable, save for the jazzy opening with a catchy tune. I did like watching it, and if you like these sorts of serious animes, then I suggest you at least try watching the first 2 episodes. If you liked them, then you're probably going to like the rest, outside of the cliched abrupt ending. That was fucking bullshit, but predictable one. What confuses me, though, is the way they've created this show. Prefix re, or re, comes from Latin, and usually signifies a repetition of sorts. A reboot is when the show discards its previous continuity and starts anew. A retool, more commonly known as a spin-off, is when a new show features characters or continues the plot lines of the old one. A revival is when a cancelled show gets new episodes or seasons. A remake is when a show retells or is heavily inspired by an older show. The problem I have with BAM is that it so heavily deviates from its source that I'm not sure it's a good idea to even consider it to be a remake and not a separate anime altogether. The old anime was about the adventures of a fusion of Mr. X and Magneto, Morticia Addams, and Beast Boy. Meanwhile, the new anime not only drastically redesigns nearly all protagonists in accordance to common modern stereotypes, it also changes the setting, changes the enemies they fight, changes the general flow of the show, and it does it all in the safest way possible, by making it a serious show for serious people that is in our days of isekais and slice-of-life shows nearly guarantees it at least some sort of cult status, if not now, then 5-10 years down the road. And that's probably my biggest issue is generally serious animes. They're fun to watch and mate adequately, but are ultimately safe and done by the numbers, making them no better than a standard isekai or a standard bread.
In stark contrast to pretty much most of the things I've watched this season, the next 2 animes are about something whose sources I actually read. Vinland Saga and Dr. Stone. I'm not sure why the latter is here, though. It's a good thing that they really did make 24 episodes instead of 12, but other than that... Now, Vinland Saga, on the other hand, is something I did look forward to, because it's one of the rare grim dark historical manga Japanese made that's not about them and actually shows at least a basic level of knowledge about the subject. The fact that it was made by Mappa is also reassuring, as even if the anime would be a total shit show, at the very least graphics would be nice. So, Vinland Saga is a 24-episode action anime about the Danish conquering of England, which basically means Vikings, politics, and a lot of gore. The plot follows a young boy named Forvenur, son of Thor, who lives in a small Icelandic village until Jomsvikings come and conscript his father into war, and after a bit of skullduggery, he gets stranded on a Viking ship and learns how to kill people. One comment I read, forgot where unfortunately, when describing Forvenur, said something along the lines of, Arvin from Attack on Titan stopped being a bitch and grew some balls, and honestly speaking, that's not the only comparison I can make to Attack on Titan, generic looks of our main heroes notwithstanding. I'll be honest with you, Vinland Saga didn't hold my interest for very long, to the point where I had to emotionally abuse myself just to sit through the last few episodes, because for the most part all of my thoughts and opinions on the show could be summarized in one sentence. This anime certainly appeals to someone, only I'm not sure these someones are my core audience. My beef with the anime started literally from the first episode. Let me tell you how the manga starts. It starts on episode 7, and the longest time the manga is about a mercenary Viking group full of colorful characters you slowly but surely grow to like. The anime starts by explaining the complicated and also interesting backstory of our little Forvenur,
Farvenir that's not only establishing him to be the main hero of the story, but also doing so in the most predictable way possible. Let's just say there's a reason why a lot of people seem to associate this anime with Attack on Titan. And the saddest part is, I can kinda see what they wanted to do. It's the same reason anime adaptation of Berserk starts not from the start, but from the Golden Saga, but here's a little problem with that plan. Golden Saga stands out because the character of Guts not only evolves from that time to his current self, but also has a lot of characters to bounce off of. Here's a bit of a express literary course for you. In the end of the day, every single character you make has a core trait. Tragic, optimist, avenger, schemer, sex pest, etc. And when making a story with multiple characters, it is very important that these traits and thus characters interacted with each other in a meaningful and balanced way, because without balance, one character will always eat other characters' screen time, and without meaning, the characters might seem aloof and pointless, boring the viewer. Avenger-type characters like Farvenir are very hard to turn into a likable protagonist without his personality bouncing off other characters, because without other characters, they usually look like a malicious little bitch whose every word is a big temper tantrum. There's a reason manga starts with Oscatel and his raid on France and only then turns into Farvenir's backstory. If the latter gets to go first, all the viewer will see is the adventures of Bitch the Angry, who will pale in comparison to the cunning and merry Oscatel, not to mention that for the most part this main hero of ours is basically a side character to him anyway. The graphics are fine, as I've said, the music is mostly thematic, save for the openings. Don't know why, but the songs they've chosen kinda don't fit the whole Viking aesthetic. As I've said, Vinland Saga certainly appeals to someone. I'm just not sure if I want to be near said someone for more than 3 seconds. Moving on. Call MD. I have nothing to say about it that I haven't already said about the manga. Yeah, I'm not sure what was I supposed to do with this one. I might as well just try farting in the microphone for all that's worth. But let's try anyway. So humanity turned it to stone, and then 59 billion or something like that years later, Science the Science Man has awoken and proceeds to science all over the place, while the Muscle Man hates science and wants to kill Science Man. And yes, in 1994 this could indeed rival Sailor Moon in its story complexity. Jokes aside though, as an anime I did like it. The developers did their best to both faithfully adapt the story as well as making it actually entertaining and endearing to watch. The women, especially blonde ones, still look a bit samey, and their eyes remind me of that popular image anime haters like to show when they want to strawman the Japanese can't draw for shit. They're distinct enough to not confuse them, and the plot is engaging enough to not get bored. But it was inevitable really. I wasn't comparing it to Fairy Tail just as a joke, you know. This sort of comics is prime adaptation material, being both visually and creatively stimulating to both read and watch moving pictures about it. So yeah, I do recommend you to at least try 2 episodes of Gynecologist Stalactite. If you liked it, then you'll probably enjoy watching it. If the comedy of the show makes you want to barf though, the toilet is right down the corridor, red door to the left. Fire Force! God, this is a stupid name. Fire Force. Those 1 block away from G.I. Joe and Thundercats. Don't let the Foot Clan scare you on the way. Even the Japanese romanji is silly. Ennen no Shobutai. The fact that no one seems to know how to write it only proves my point. But jokes aside, this is actually the show I did look forward to a bit, because it was made by the same guy who made Soul Eater, and dear lord, does it show. Another reason is because I've heard a small scandal surrounding it, that one of the characters is over-sexualized, though seeing it for myself I can safely conclude that people who yelled about it have at best only recently started watching anime, at worst never seen a goddamn anime in their lives. Allow me to explain my point via frames from the opening of 2 works of the same author. This is Tamaki. She represents the cat girl stereotype. In the opening, she completely kicks ass of multiple enemies with her Nekomata powers. This is Blair. If anything, Tamaki is under-sexualized. But I digress. The story is that Mother Earth has finally got sick of our shit and decided to enact global warming in a way that even the most adamant climate change deniers will shut up. And so after most of Earth literally went down in flames, some bastards survived and by the power of magical fire bullshit had built a pseudo-Catholic theocracy in Tokyo, Japan. Our main hero is Shinra Kusakabe, who joins a unit of firefighters to kick ass with style. Oh, and save his brother from being molested by aliens or something like that. Overall, it's a generic military force of a lone city-state fights against a barely understood threat, which is slightly disappointing but at the same time predictable. The characters are probably the show's strongest element. Shinra Kukasabe and the rest of his squad are both quirky enough to be interested in their shenanigans and have enough chemistry and screen time for the viewer
viewers to care about them, which can't be said for some of the enemies, unfortunately. A lot of them fall into the cool powers, little personality category. It makes battles entertaining, for sure, but let's just say such antagonists rarely get their own Dakimakuras. In fact, outside of the titular squad and Shinra Cucumber, a lot of the world seems at best underexplained and rule of cool at worst. The graphics are overall fine, with design being the most memorable part of the show. A lot of shots and visuals work excellently in creating the needed atmosphere. The show knows when to be unnerving, when to be sad, when to be scary, which is a good thing. The music, on the other hand, isn't that memorable, but overall quite nice and pleasant to listen to, as well as having a recognizable recursive theme. All of this combined makes this anime a good shonen, perfect for kids and teenagers to watch, but if you're one of those pretentious artsy-fartsy twats who want something emotional and twee from their animes, then this one isn't for you. As for those who have watched a lot of anime in their lives, well, I respect this anime more than I like it. I respect the fairly active plot, the creativity behind their powers, which I'm totally going to steal should I be in need of fire-based spells but couldn't be asked to make anything fancier than 3 types of fireballs. I also respect those gay communists who are able to sustain themselves for a month by only ingesting truckers' semen, but it's not a lifestyle I can sincerely recommend. The same way I also can't sincerely recommend an anime whose name and storylines I had to force myself to remember a day after I finished watching it. It is a competently made anime that offers nothing of value to those who've seen similar stuff multiple times already. Now, how do I end it with a semen joke? Beastars is an anime about stuff created by who gives a shit. Let's just get this over with already. No one initially cared about this anime, not when I had 15 of them to go through, and to be perfectly honest, it didn't really impress me, both in description and in the opening. Ooh, a big bad wolf predating over a small, cute-looking bunny while jazz music plays. How original. It's probably going to be some sort of drama about forbidden love or child molestation. At the very least, stuff like Arifureta looked trashy enough to kinda have a laugh about them. These sorts of animes tend to be either overly dramatic and fake, or just a miserable bore fest where I suck, you suck, everything suck, and I hope you all die. But then in his infinite fucking wisdom, one coworker on his own volition watched it, liked it, and started obsessively pestering me to make a ramble about it. And so he pestered and pestered and pestered and finally warned me out, so congratulations, you obnoxious twat. Not like I had a lot of stuff to do anyway, and having watched it, I can now confidently state that it was about as what I expected from it. I don't intend it as a kick in the stomach it sounds like, it's just that it feels like the intended point of the anime is less enjoy watching it and more enjoy posting about the show's social commentary. So, Beastars. In a surprisingly progressive cosmopolitan city, carnivores and herbivores are living a stable and happy coexistence, at the very least as happy and stable as you can get in this scenario, until suddenly one herbivore schoolboy gets viciously eaten alive. Insert typical xenophobic remark here. Our main hero is Legoshi, a pacifist grey wolf who suddenly gets a turn-on and a hard-on to a female dwarf rabbit named Haru, and the story is about them coming to terms with that, as well as all the social shit that comes with that. You know, puberty, drama clubs, random politics of the city out of nowhere, the usual. The usual is, in fact, how I would describe the show's plot in its entirety. It's not a bad plot by any means, I was in the mood for some drama, and it does avoid the usual serialized drama potholes they usually fall into. Instead, it reminds me more of those OVA dramas, for better or worse. The graphics are 3D with a slight blend of 2D, but the style and the models they use are nice, simple, and stylized enough you get used to them. The music is actually one of the show's strongest suits, perfectly fitting the dramatic tone the show wants to portray, and it's nice to listen to separately. I have to repeat myself that I don't say all this to harm or somehow belittle the show. By all means, this is the best serialized drama anime I've seen in a while, but I might as well give it away now, so shove some condoms down your ear holes to avoid spoilers. I think the show peaked when Legoshi had a fist fight with the tiger. It's already shown everything interesting it could throw at you, and the game's been given away, so all it can do now is throw the gingerly lame territory of social commentary, so of course it eventually starts talking about herbivores versus carbivores, the moral justice versus reality, and it all ends up with a scene where a boy beats up a bunch of gang members to save the girl. And if anything, this made me take the anime less seriously. Thank God you're talking about the ethical problems of meat consumption. I was almost lulled into actually liking this anime with its quirky characters and a mediocre love story. Oh, and I have to make an educated guess that the one who killed that alpaca is none of the characters we've already established, because that's how these stories work. The more character is in the background, the easier it is to turn him into a plot device further on, and after the bit with the Lion Mafia, I just kinda stopped giving a shit altogether. So in summary, Beastars is a memorable drama with nice pacing, music, and graphics, but the story starts being predictable once the rabbit is out of the hat.
it. I personally advise you to stop watching it should the beat become familiar. I've learned that after my second marriage. Time for interseasonals, and this time it's all the stuff you people asked me to watch over the years. God, I hate you all so much right now, but this was inevitable. I did agree on the poll after all. So the first one on our list is Low Life! You know, I'm watching this list and seeing shows that under normal circumstances I would never watch. Oh goody, that's not going to become obnoxious later on or anything. Love Life is a 13-episode idol anime made by Studio Sunshine in 2013. Our characters live a happy life in their girls-only school until suddenly they're lambasted with the fact that it's going to close in some vague but close point of time. This prompts our main hero, Kosaka Honoka, to literally scramble an idol group overnight and start their perilous journey to both become the best idol group in town and to save their beloved school, which most definitely doesn't put drugs in the food to ensure loyalty. Maybe it's because I only learned to write when I was technically an adult, but this fascination with schools always bewildered me. Never in my life have I seen a person who genuinely, unironically told me, yes, I loved my school days so much I wish to relive them. School is a place for youth to gather in herds and either get educated or get high on glue. If there weren't any schools, they would probably get both of those things elsewhere with little to no problem. The only exception to this I can think of are those religious schools where you can't get high on glue because you'll get flogged. Not like that ever stopped me. But I digress. This is some of the most generic anime I've seen recently. It checks out every possible cliché and more with such diligence it's almost admirable. You have the bouncy main hero, the shy and calm main hero, the blonde Russian girl that's a villain but then turns into a hero, and the transition was so blatant it hurt. Have you ever noticed that all villains who turn into heroes have two voice modes? When they're antagonists, they talk in deep and strict tone that should signify that they don't like our heroes that much, but when they're good guys, their voice shifts into a calmer, higher position. What was I talking about? Ah, that's right, heroes. You have the small attention whore whose presence would be genuinely irritating if not for her caring personality, the girl that sexually molests other girls, and the flow of the show in general is also fairly generic. They train to become idols, sing one song per 2-3 episodes, rinse and repeat. To be perfectly honest, all the stuff behind the scenes about this anime is much more interesting than the anime itself. This is a work of not only one mere studio, but also a record label, a manga publisher. This thing has video games, sequels, spin-offs, and even their own discography, with Muse acting like a real group. This actually makes me wonder about stuff. Recently I've heard a lot of scandals surrounding virtual people. There are people who attack sex bots and various virtual porn models, yet Japan seemingly doesn't have any problems with this whole thing. They have virtual YouTubers, virtual singers, etc. I do wonder when will the West have similar stuff. I wonder if I'll be allowed a virtual avatar. The graphics are nice, the animation is cheap, the music is actually not that bad, though it's not really something I would listen to. I wouldn't be surprised to hear something like that in a slice of life anime. Overall, the show hasn't really aged that well, at least personally. Zombieland Saga is not only better as an idol anime, but also features more song numbers per episodes, as well as better written characters, but then again, this anime isn't really made for me, so... go away. I think I won't surprise anyone by saying this. I don't really like Japanese comedies. If you watched me for any number of episodes, this much should become evident, so please don't think lightly for what I'm going to say next, but Mariaholic is not only the best anime I've ever watched, but also literally the best anime work I've seen in decades. Who would have thought that a typical romance comedy anime with plot so boring and predictable I watched 3 episodes of it and concluded that scraping your genitals with sandpaper is a more enjoyable experience than watching it would be worth every second of my time. Mariaholic is a revolutionary 12-episode anime made by Studio Shaft that combines romantic anime, slice of life, action, drama, werewolves, and space opera into one coherent package. The show starts with Kanako Miyamai, a Japanese spy who suffered a traumatic rape experience that forced her to be afraid of all men, given her last mission to infiltrate the closed Catholic school that rumored to create mystical beings for their own sake. But during her mission she encounters Maria Shido and falls in love with her, only to find out that she's actually a he and a werewolf revolutionary leader seeking to overthrow Catholic Church and establish an anarchist utopia, and so these two must combine their powers to unravel the complex socio-political web surrounding werewolves and the Japanese society. And honestly speaking, I wasn't really expecting how deep the anime story went. Just by watching the first 3 episodes, you'd think that this is just an average shitty comedy they shit out every season or so, but once I realized that this turned into an intense shootout between alien lizard people and the Catholic Secret Service in episode 10, I couldn't really tell you where any significant changes occurred in the intervening time. Another thing I'm impressed by is Maria Shido as a character, because while I initially thought that just making him a cross-dresser is probably the cheapest way of making a comedic character outside of maybe jokes about your mom, I was genuinely surprised that the anime legitimately cared about his backstory enough to dedicate 2 full episodes to it, as well as explaining the importance of Lizardmen from planet Venus in the story. And while I don't want to spoil too much, I was extremely moved by the scene where he accepts his Lizardman heritage only to use it to tease Kaneko some more. It's honestly difficult to me to even pinpoint my most favorite thing about the anime, as it's just the most perfect thing I've ever come across. From the seamless use of 3D to the rich and vibrant animation to the music that manages to combine Norwegian and Ukrainian folk with Japanese death metal. Oh, and who can forget the fourth wall-breaking scene where Kanako storms into Minari Endo's apartment and kicks her into her vagina. The only criticism I have for Maria Holic is that it's really lacking in the location department. We only see the school, the Lizardman laboratory, and a small bit of space in the last episode, which isn't really all that much considering the epic scale of the show, but I do kinda understand why they did so. After all, it must have been very expensive to make an anime so complex. I also understand why people like this anime so much, alongside many others, most definitely worthwhile products, because if this wasn't a good anime and people were just a bunch of bonobo monkeys who mindlessly consume anything so long as it has a good girl in it, that would be really fucking sad. If that was the case, then I would have to say that it's really sad that a show about a cross-dressing boy and a lesbian girl is what it takes to make people happy. Not the jokes, mind you, not the story, but the sheer fact that a boy looks like a girl. Maybe humanity as a species deserves coronavirus, because clearly modern leisurely lifestyle most people have is affecting their brains in a negative way, if they find this to be funny. But anyway, the point was, I'm just glad that I don't live in a world where such scenarios exist. Now, if you excuse me, I'll have to end this ramble prematurely. I have a game of Overwatch to play with Nicolas Cage. Anime people want me to watch are like my current sex life. Miserable, lonesome, and good only in my vivid imagination. And the more I hear about the ever-growing list of animes that got cancelled due to coronavirus, the more of that misery creeps into my daily life. Look, I'm not saying that you're a bad person if you like Maria Holic, though I would probably try my best to stay as far away from you as possible. I'm just saying that... Okay, maybe you are a bad person. Macross Zero is set in 2008, 1 year before the events of the original Macross series, depicting the final battles of the Unification Wars between the United Nations military and the anti-UN forces, and is also set in the South Pacific, where a giant alien spaceship crash, designated S-1, landed 9 years earlier. I don't know what the fuck any of this means. This is a passage from Macross Wiki and it explains nothing. To its credit, though, the show doesn't really require any previous Macaroon knowledge to watch it. We follow Kudo Shin, a typical anime protagonist of the permanently pissed off variety, and Nome Sara, a priestess of a typical exotic culture whose sole job in the anime is to yell at whichever typical modern status quo things need to be yelled at this episode. After getting his ass kicked by what many local military engineers considered to be a butchering of aerodynamics, Shin lands on a typical native island where natives frolic in the valley until a war happens and everything gets sad. And yes, the usual "are we the baddies" is also present. I'll be honest with you, Chekaroon Macaroon didn't really hold my interest for too long, and while watching it I constantly caught myself thinking two things over and over. There's really nothing in here for mecha lovers, and boy, it sure does want me to take it seriously now, does it? Typically for mecha anime, it tries to present itself as a serious anime with serious and profound things to say to the audience, but I'm sorry if I'll sound a bit harsh here, but I have a hard time taking seriously a show about discount GoBots and their daring war over a plot device. What exactly am I supposed to say about this plot? Atlantis, Avatar, Darling in the Three Axes, again Avatar, Steam Boy, and all the other stuff. You've seen one show with this plot, you've pretty much seen them all. Macross is Sailor Moon for boys, and unless you're a die-hard fan of this franchise, there's very little point in watching it, and if you aren't, then I suggest you go watch the first one, or, you know, the ones that are better, because I've only tangentially heard about Macross lore, and this prequel didn't give me any more clarity about it. In fact, it left me even more confused. It's like trying to masturbate while riding a supersonic jet that barrel rolls constantly. So in conclusion, I'm sure this is a really nice anime for people who genuinely like the Macintosh universe, but people like that are definitely not the type of people I'll be willing to stalk on an uninhabitable island with. Auntie, you stupid piece of shit, why do you antagonize your audience 2 episodes in a row? It's not funny and the views are getting lower than they already are. Here's this anime that's loved and respected. I dare you try find something bad to say about it. Ha! You can't! Well, that's weird. March Comes In Like a Lion is a 2-season slice-of-life sports anime, 22 episodes per season, made by Studio Shaft that tells us a story about Rei Kiriyama, the saddest human on planet Earth. I've only watched the first season because watching 44 episodes in a span of a week is, while possible, would probably damage my mental health, but truth to be told, after finishing it, I have enough of an idea where it goes that I don't really feel the need to watch it further. Let me say before we go on that March Comes In Like a Lion is a beautifully drawn and directed anime where every episode has a scene or a frame almost begging you to use it as a screensaver, as well as an intro sequence that in a short time conveys our protagonist's character and his style of life. So the question you must ask yourself, dear listener, is whether or not this all is enough for you. Because outside of it, I don't really feel there's much substance to the anime. Oh yes, anti-substance, in a genre notorious for its deepness and complexity. Just admit that you want to shit on it for shits and giggles and move on. I would, imaginary critic in my head, but that's not what I'm trying to say here. The main premise of the story is that Rei Kiriyama, a 17-year-old professional shogi player with a troubled past, is having a coming-of-age drama while living alone in a rented apartment, and we watch as he matures, makes mistakes, etc., and I kinda think the show is trying a bit too hard. It mixes personal drama, slice of life, sports anime, and comedy anime, resulting in a show where almost every important character is suffering in one way or another, while cracking jokes that make it really hard to take the situation seriously, in addition to having prolonged sessions of shogi that more reminded me of Ping Pong the animation in its attention to details. My guess is that you're not really supposed to think about everything here too hard, since you're supposed to feel sad watching it, and to its credit, if you're having life problems yourself, then it's very easy to empathize with the main hero, as his problems are basically universal. If you're like me, however, and you can easily see through it all, the show will feel like it's trying too hard. I was officially fed up with it once they've introduced, in order to not spoil too much, a massive flapping cunt whose sole purpose in the story is to act like a cunt to hide her daddy issues. Introducing characters like this in a drama is like a half-naked girl in an action anime, in that they're officially the point where the author ran out of ideas. Oh, boo boo boo, Mr. Critic here with his negativity searching for any reason to shit on the anime. Well, alright, it's still a nicely made anime with decent animation and fine music, the characters are all visually distinctive and there's not a lot of them to remember, the shogi parts are actually pretty educational, it's a perfectly fine functional slice of life drama that I, if I weren't to watch it for this show, would watch 3 episodes of, think it's okay, and then never watch it ever again. Well, back from vacation, so let's start with something easy and detotamo some anime. On today's chopping block we have Seton Academy, Join the Pack, and Bordello Reviews. It has a name, but I don't really care, it's Bordello Reviews. Bordello Reviews is a 12-episode sex comedy anime developed by Studio Passion, and I kinda understand why, what with a name like that. It centers around, well, 2 dudes and one, I think intersexual is the correct term, though don't quote me on that, fucking their way through various warhouses and then writing a review based on their experience. The meat of the show is in the bordellos themselves as well as the various races they review. Seton Academy, meanwhile, is a 12-episode comedy anime developed by Studio Gokumi that tells us a story of Jin Mazama, whose defining characteristic is that he's a massive racist and a human supremacist wishing to exterminate every animal species in his school filled with animal people. How relatable! In his attempts to woo a human female, he helps her establish a cooking club, which slowly turns into an interspecies club, and the show's about them going places and interacting with various animals. The biggest problem with both shows is just how damn predictable they are, both comedy and plot-wise. For the most part, the main punchline is that in this world, people do things differently from ours, which I guess is relatable to the average Twitter user, but not so relatable to people experienced in comedy or, heaven forbid, took courses on writing it. Oh look, koalas eat poop when they're young because otherwise they can't eat their main food. It's funny because she wants to eat poop. Oh look, a bunch of lilims are trapped inside a bordello and fucking people to death. It's funny because that's the nature of lilims. I don't know, maybe I'm just not English enough to laugh at that sort of humor. But fortunately there's more to both animes than poop and sex jokes. Bordello Reviews, for example, has a surprisingly intricate world building despite what it is. No, that came out wrong. Because of what it is. It might sound a bit unbelievable, but not a lot of serious works ever describe mating practices of other races, even though many cultures are often defined by their views on sexuality. Though I find most of the jokes here tasteless, I can't deny that none of them, bar an occasional reference to other animes, look out of place in such a world, and I can recommend this anime at least to world builders as a form of educational anime. And speaking of educational, Seton Academy, tasteless and blatant as it is, does have some good points to it, mainly in the animal roster. For the most part, a lot of the animal girls depicted in the show have never been shown in other animal girl-themed animes I've watched, and especially none of them have gone out of their way to incorporate animal traits into their comedy and interactions. Worst comes to worst, this is a pretty entertaining educational original anime, provided that you'll actually stay conscious enough to actually process that new information. The graphics are pretty average, the music is mostly stock as well as the character personality. In spirit of bordello reviews, I should probably rate it like they do in the anime, but I have a hunch that everyone already done so. Instead, let me try be more original about it. Bordello reviews are akin to a 3-star meal at a McDonald's, while Set in Academy is a 3-star meal from Gregor, the Romanian sausage merchant. Both are equally edible, maybe even tasty, both have equal chances of giving you an explosive diarrhea and possibly syphilis. The ever-growing genre of cutesy family-oriented anime. Blessed be thy name. If it wasn't for you, all I would have are action animes, slices of life, and heaven forbid, comedies, while with you I get to have some small bit of wholesomeness in this job, which makes my old non-existent heart bleed with joy. That or the heart attack got me a bit prematurely there. Somali and the Forest Spirit is a 12-episode fantasy anime about a girl named Somali and a forest spirit named Dad, both of which are probably some of the most unfortunate names to be given, but I digress. Golem exists to protect the forest, which he does so diligently until he finds a human girl, bonds with her, and then ventures into the world to find other humans because he only has 1 year to live. Oh, and humans are almost extinct because they're so xenophobic in a world full of various species that they've decided that extinction is much more preferable to living in a diverse world, and so others respected their decision and helped to the best of their abilities. Kinda like most Let's Play YouTubers who decided that streaming on Twitch with their underboob open is much more profitable than having some integrity. A sad plot indeed, but in action it's much less gloomy than I originally thought. The show's narrative and pacing are very well designed and structured. There is a lot of show don't tell in this anime, a lot of silent scenes accompanied by music alone, and the introduction to lore elements and story progression are done very carefully and tactful. In fact, for the most part, this feels like classical Disney more than typical fantasy anime, which may or may not suit your interests, provided you actually like non-violent fantasy anime. The graphics are average for this sort of genre, but they manage to hide it by various panoramic shots. The music is mostly generic melancholic piano made to make you feel sad, but in its defense, unlike some anime I can name, the music is used sparingly, dare I say strategically, all across the anime, and for the most part it is thematically in place and easy enough to replicate. The show's biggest problem is its format. This isn't an action anime, nor does it have some deeper themes or some important lesson to tell you. It's just a story about a human child and her golem dad going around the world and meeting various interesting people. Kinda like a girl's last tour in a way. There are some unanswered questions, like how these golems even breed, and I guess the story is a tad bit predictable for people who watched any number of similar dramas, and also it's a bit unclear on how other species generally justify human genocide, especially since it's not like they can't talk or feel anything, so you kinda have to wonder, are there other instances of them just eating other species, or do they have a defensive mechanism like the harpies? Also, why did he live for so long while his family literally exploded into feathers? Okay, Mr. Critic, you can stop padding the episode. Yeah, I guess I'm being too nitpicky about it. I'd say if you're one of those people who knows the value of a nice, calming story, then it's not the worst thing to waste your time on. If not, then, well, I guess you already tuned out and playing Fortnite on your Zooms or whatever satanic thing you youngsters into these days. As long-time viewers may probably guess, I'm somewhat of an animation supremacist. I believe that animation of any kind is inherently better than cinematography, and there's nothing a film can do that a similarly animated film can do the same or even better. And judging by the fact that most popular movies these days are one actor's rights violation away from being 3D cartoons, Hollywood probably agrees with me. And with all the bright, shiny superhero moral messaging junk being churned out by films industry, nothing makes me happier than knowing that Japan will continue doing their animated, bright, shiny junk. That being said, there are two genres in anime that the West usually does better: horror and detective stories, and for a reason, mind you. It's hard to be scared of a drawn thing that can't really hurt you for starters. The best thing you can do is either creep people out or gross people out. As for detectives, Japanese just have trouble writing them altogether. Not like they can't do it, it's just that they are more interested in the deductive reasoning or social commentary than whodunit. Inspector is a 12-episode mystery fiction anime created by Brains Base Studio that tells us a story about a generic anime boy number 4567 and a disabled person shitposting a creepypasta to death. Let me explain. So the main protagonist of the story is Kotoko Iwanaga, whose job description is a mediator between humans and spirits, but as usual with job descriptions, they tell you a lot of fancy words only for you to end up explaining how computers work for geriatrics patients. Here, Kotoko's job is basically being a weird mix of a demagogue and a Wikipedia for spirits who are too lazy to get with the times. The other protagonist is Kuro Sakuragawa, whose main power is being a bullshit literal deus ex machina, a weird mix of an immortal who has to die in order to predict the future. Where have I seen that before? The biggest problem with the show is the whole mystery thing, because instead of operating on the whodunit principle, it uses what I like to call magic deduction. To illustrate, there is a ghost of a dead girl running around the city, so our heroes have to pacify it. In a detective story, the investigator would have to first gather evidence, gather witness reports, combine them together into a coherent narrative, and present it to both the perpetrator and us, the audience. A good detective is where we can see a certain string of logic in what our investigators doing. Here, they recognize the problem, gather a bit of evidence they usually already knew, create a narrative that may or may not be correct, and then do constant 90-degree turns the second someone starts to dob them with new evidence we've never seen before, piling up into this incoherent, schizophrenic mess. Call me an old-fashioned little grandma, but I usually don't expect internet troll tactics from my detectives. Oh, look at Mr. Mask with his tiny brain here. Better go look at this We Are MMO anime that has a girl in an armored bathing suit. Nice and simple, just like you like it. First of all, suck my dick. Second of all, the resulting mess is not even entertaining to watch. You'd think that the least an incoherent ramble could do is to be fun to dissect, but no, it's tedious as all hell, and a lot of times was testing my patience. With no coherent chain of logic, everything the heroes say and do turns into white noise, and once you adjust to the insanity around you, the entire thing just starts being predictable. So you've created this mystery, and even with all the ass pulls, you're going the most obvious direction you can take. If you stop watching the show on episode 9 and just skip to episode 12, nothing of value will be lost story-wise. You'll just skip the tedious pretentiousness of a tiny Degorochov lookalike fighting a ghost via shitposting on the internet 3-4 episodes in a row. The music and visual direction are the better parts of the anime, openings and endings especially. The music in general is a bit of a hit and miss. It's functional, but I find it hard to listen to seriously, as most of it would be more suitable in some old Final Fantasy or Legend of Zelda game than a detective story. The graphics are average for a serious anime, the design of various ghosts and demons is pretty spot on and entertaining to watch, and the human characters of the story are nicely written, and you can even believe in their interactions with each other, time skips notwithstanding. So in conclusion, Inspector is Bakemonogatari without the wit, Boogie Pop without philosophy, and so on. There's little reason to watch it outside of its novelty value, and even that is debatable. The most polite way for me to describe it would probably be with the sentence, there's probably a market for it, but that's a pretty shitty way to describe it. Well, I suppose watching this is less repulsive than crush fetish videos. Hey, remember the times when people actually gave a shit? Those were good times. Those were the times where anime based on MMOs existed, and sometimes were at the very least not vomit-inducing. And now look where we are. We're making stories about MMOs because, I don't know, Japanese writers like to refer to menus and such. Sometimes this whole notion of virtual MMOs feels like a weird and lazy cop-out to implement RPG mechanics into an otherwise typical fantasy story. Continuing the trend of the most generic-sounding games ever created, Infinite Dendrogram is a 13-episode VR MMO anime created by Studio Naz that tells us about the adventures of Ray Starling, his blow-up doll nemesis, and the inevitable heat death of the universe. Tell me what, dear listener, do you even give a shit anymore? Look at him! Look at this fucking puss! Just seeing this kisser is already enough to guess where this all will go. You know, I'm starting to miss Grimgar of Fantasy and Dash. In fact, that should be some form of a test. Ignorance is thinking Grimgar of Fantasy and Dash is a boring torture porn. Despair is when you're sitting on the couch, watching Infinite Dendrogram and wishing you were watching Grimgar. And speaking of Grimgar, remember in that episode I talked about why people generally like isekai genre? It's because the main hero in those stories is usually a dork who's trapped in a place that either really wants him dead or just really bizarre, and so the audience can empathize with his struggle, building a sort of relationship with the character. We Are MMOs, being an offshoot of the isekai genre, operate by the same principle, and the biggest problem with Infinite Dendrogram is that the main hero is shit. He barely struggles throughout the anime, gets cool items effectively from the start, most of his entourage or friends are either powerful people or living gods, and the saddest part is that there's barely any stakes save for the last episode, and even those get obliterated in the last episode. Yes, there's this whole is this really a game business, but that's merely a Chekhov's gun that's left virtually untouched by the end of the show. And speaking of that, after watching the show and thinking about it, I think I finally understand what irritates me the most about this generic Asian fantasy, and that is, for the most part, that as a world it makes very little sense. You know those typical Western fantasy worlds, the ones that are made by stacking cliché on a cliché and hoping it will somehow stick even though you can see the laziness just by lightly poking at it? In a typical Western fantasy, this usually takes the form of racial stereotypes, geography, naming, cooking, etc. In a typical Japanese, maybe even Asian stories, it takes the form of style mixing. Asian sword masters are fighting steam dragons alongside cowboy-looking gunslingers armed with rocket launchers, or to make it more thematic, a scientist on a giant dragon is shitting out tens of thousands of monsters that are defeated by a martial artist and his futuristic bed battleship, while a paladin on a horse is trying to climb the dragon to talk to the scientist. None of these concepts make any sense or have a relation to one another. They are just thrown in there for the sake of rule of cool, and when everything in their pet goldfish looks like some final boss in other games, looking badass loses all credibility whatsoever. But so far I only shat on the anime. Are there any good points to it? Well, there are. Story-wise, it doesn't pull any punches, which is a nice addition to generally tame stories. I liked the class system. It's not that unique, being the typical job class system from Final Fantasy with a coat of paint, but there is something satisfying in actually making a conscious progression from a lowly soldier to an epic warrior of yore, and it's also nice that there is an option to skip it just by doing the requirements for higher tier jobs from the very start with all the consequences it intends. The idea that only one player in the game can hold a title of a superior job is an interesting one as well, as it helps generate players' lore. 72-hour account locking on death is something I'm a bit iffy about, but it's not something I would be against. It's also one of the rare occasions where the anime treats MMO like an MMO and shows that there are people who may not play the same sex as they are in real life. I think Look Horizon was the last time I've seen such a thing previously. The graphics are nothing special, there's an occasional animation fuck up and sometimes the lips are weirdly positioned on the model, but it's nothing too outrageous or worthy of attention. The music, like in previous anime, is one, maybe three songs that sound kinda the same. Unending monotony is the definition of a conveyor belt factory-made anime. Technically decent, plot-wise generic, and probably will ultimately be successful. This is anathema to beings like me who actually like thinking about the junk we consume, but I guess it's an adequate time waster if you have nothing else to do. And hate yourself. Do you hear that, ladies and gentlemen? That is the sound of a laser drill burrowing through the Earth's crust in search of valuable minerals. But also that's the sound that this season is finally coming to a close. Only one anime left before the people's favorite top 5, so let's do something interesting. Dorohedoro is a 12-episode punk anime created by Studio Mappa that tells us about a big dude with a lizard head named Kaiman and his friends, enemies, bizarre adventures, and a completely relaxed attitude to life, death, and bodily mutilation. Not gonna lie, the biggest reason why I got interested in this anime was because it was described to me as the adventures of a Zionist reptilian in his search of his lost head, which as a premise is bound to attract some attention, not gonna lie, but I have to fairly warn people, there is not a single mention of Judaism in this anime. A shame, really, not a lot of people delve into that mythos, even though it is weird as all hell. The story dumps us into the hole. No, not that hole, this hole. A vast, probably post-apocalyptic city, though it's hard to say for sure, maybe it's less dead and more polluted, you know? The hole is where humans live, and they live their happy human lives until sorcerers from another dimension come and start practicing their smoke-based magic on humans, hence pollution. We follow the adventures of Kaiman, a big dude who has a lizard head and wants to find who caused that lizard head on him, his buddy Nikaido, who owns a food place and feeds Kaiman, and who's basically a weird mix of Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and those mushroom mages from the other Scrolls, and other weird people and not so much people. Basically, they kill a lot of shit in the most gruesome way, and that's the main point of the show. The plot and the characters are the show's strongest element. They all share that Tarantino-esque style of relationship, occasionally dialogue, and their love to brutally murder people, which probably is what makes them all dear to me. Every important character is visually distinct, has distinct mannerisms, and is entertaining to watch even in episodes that are effectively just fillers to the overall plot. And boy do they like to faff around a lot. If this was to be made into a movie, you could have cut out about 50% of the thing, and it would still have some scenes that are absolutely pointless. Fortunately, whereas in other shows this would probably be a detriment, here it gives some characters time to shine, which would otherwise be forced to share room with Mr. Lizardhead and friends. The music is also quite nice, though I do admit that it is an acquired taste. It simultaneously sounds like a generic Japanese pop soundtrack and one of those weird hip-hop tracks. You know the type, where it's all beeps and tuk-tuk-tuks with a singer mewling in the background, and the fact that all intros and outros are made by the same group, and this group is affiliated with Toho Animation, suggests that some skullduggery was present during making of this anime, though it's mostly just a hunch. As for the graphics, well, the scenery is nice and can be quite creative, especially in Sorcerer World, but overall it's a grim, drab palette with 3D models running around. The 3D in this is serviceable, somewhere on the Beast Stars level. Good to see that lessons learned from Berserk about framerate have finally gotten through their thick Japanese skulls. The biggest issue I probably had with the graphics overall is the saturation and the occasional kaleidoscope-esque imagery, especially especially in the opening. Oh god, the opening. Shit like this is the reason why people on YouTube give trigger warnings for flashing lights. It's especially horrible if you binge watch it and don't skip the opening, because one replay is fine enough, 3 in a row will start making your head hurt, and the bright and fast action of the show doesn't help much. I literally couldn't sit through more than 5 episodes without needing to take a break, because the visuals are trippy, and like with LSD, the only thing those do for me is make my head hurt. You know what? After watching it, I was genuinely on board the hype train for but a day of rest and a packet full of Catarolac later, I can't really remember why I liked it in the first place. Yes, the characters are fun and the music is entertaining, but it's riddled with little time wasters, has graphics that are best described as a bad acid trip, and in the end is so heavily reliant on a hypothetical second season that if they won't deliver it in the next 2-3 years, I'm probably going to boycott any Mappa-made anime out of spite and piss on its corpse on various image boards. I guess as a spectacle it is okay, though my advice for people watching it would be to watch only 1-2 episodes a day or have a barfing bucket next to you.